Tonight, let your eyes grow heavy as we drift toward a place the maps call a small green island, but the history books can never quite decide what shelf to put it on. Ireland, a country where the documented truth is so peculiar it sounds like someone made it up, and where the folklore is so specific, so bureaucratic, so oddly official, that it somehow ends up filed as actual policy. This is a land where a national highway once curved politely around a single thorn bush, where tiny mythical men are technically shielded by continental law, and where, once a year, a wild mountain goat is dressed, crowned, and given the run of an entire town. And nobody there finds any of this the least bit strange. Before we sink into tonight's stories, a quiet word of thanks. This episode was suggested by someone in the comments, and honestly, that is why this channel keeps growing at all, because you keep handing me the strange corners of history I would never have found on my own. If tonight's journey helps you drift off, a like helps the channel more than you know, but only ever if you mean it. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is right where you are, because somewhere out there, it is always 3 in the morning. This show is also streaming in audio form now, so if you would rather just listen with the lights off, you'll find that link waiting below. And if you ever want more of these long, slow nights, the channel membership now unlocks extra hours of ad-free listening, ready whenever sleep won't come easily. So dim the lights. Let a fan hum somewhere in the room, that soft gray static that makes the dark feel less empty. Get settled and maybe tuck the blanket in tight around your feet, just in case something small and mischievous gets curious about your toes tonight. Let's just sit with a few questions for a moment before we begin. How does one country end up with more saints than main roads, more famous ghosts than famous streetlights? How does a national epic, a genuinely serious piece of literature, boil down to an argument about a cow? Did people truly believe that cutting down the wrong tree could kill a man? Was there really a witchcraft trial where the star evidence was simply that a woman was disliked? Did a monk once cross the entire Atlantic Ocean in a boat made of stitched leather, centuries before anyone had heard of Columbus? And could you survive even one dinner party in a country where your neighbor might actually sue you over a bee? Settle in, because tonight the line between recorded history and campfire legend gets very blurry indeed. Welcome to Ireland, a place where the truth likes to wear a disguise, tip its hat to you, and then tell you a story anyway. Let's begin with the man whose face is stitched onto every green hat in every parade on the planet. Because St. Patrick, patron saint of all Ireland, was not Irish, not even slightly. He was born in Roman Britain, the son of a reasonably comfortable family, and by his own later writing, he cared nothing at all for faith as a boy. Then, at around 16 years old, Irish raiders seized him from his home, dragged him across the sea, and put him to work herding sheep alone on a cold hillside for 6 long years. Most people who survive an ordeal like that spend the rest of their life putting as much distance as possible between themselves and their captors. Patrick did something almost incomprehensible. After escaping, training as a churchman, and rebuilding his life at home, he chose, entirely voluntarily, to sail straight back to the island that had enslaved him. And notice something else while we're here. The snakes he supposedly banished never actually needed banishing, because Ireland never had any snakes to begin with. Let's slow down on just how unusual that decision really was. Around the age of 16, an age at which we generally don't trust a teenager with the car keys, Patrick was taken from everything familiar and thrown into forced labor at the very edge of what his world considered civilization. Years of cold, isolation, and hunger followed, years spent talking to sheep, and increasingly talking to God. When his escape finally came, he made his way to a ship, talked his way onto it, and eventually reached home to a family who must have believed the worst was finally behind him. It wasn't. Years later, he told them he was going back on purpose to serve the very people who had stolen his youth from him. One imagines that conversation did not go smoothly. Here's the detail the parades tend to leave out entirely. Patrick wasn't even the first Christian missionary in Ireland. There were believers on the island before he ever arrived, and at least one other bishop had already been sent ahead of him. The tidy image of a lone hero striding into a pagan wilderness and single-handedly converting an entire nation is, generously speaking, an exaggeration. What Patrick actually left behind wasn't a legend at all. It was two short pieces of writing in rough, apologetic Latin. One is a confession of his own life and doubts. The other is a furious letter condemning a warlord for the slaughter of his converts. These two documents are among the very earliest surviving voices in Irish history, and they belong not to a saint of stained glass, but to a nervous, stubborn, self-critical man who kept apologizing for his own poor grammar. He was not a myth. He was a real, tired, complicated human being. And that beloved image of him holding up a shamrock to explain the Holy Trinity, there's no evidence he ever did that. The story doesn't show up in writing until more than 1,000 years after his death, a gap roughly as wide as the distance between the fall of the Roman Empire and the invention of the printing press. As for the snakes, geology already did that work for him. Ireland was cut off by rising seas after the last ice age before snakes could ever slither back onto the island, so driving them out would have been an easy afternoon regardless of who tried it. So the founding figure of Irish Christian identity turns out to be a foreign-born former slave, a self-described mediocre writer, and the subject of two beloved legends invented centuries after he was in the ground. It might be the most fittingly Irish origin story imaginable. Almost none of the charming parts are true, and the true parts are far stranger than anything invented about him. But for all his fame, Patrick was a relative latecomer to this island. Long before he ever set foot on Irish soil, other people had already left their mark here, carved into stone, aligned to the sun, and built with a precision that still leaves engineers uneasy today. Centuries before a single block was stacked at Giza, farmers working the banks of the River Boyne raised a monument so exact that it still functions today, on schedule, every single year. Newgrange is roughly 5,000 years old, which makes it older than the Great Pyramid of Egypt and older than Stonehenge, a fact that Ireland's tourism board is more than happy to remind you of at every opportunity. It's an enormous mound of packed earth and stone, with a narrow stone passage cut into its heart. And for about a week around the winter solstice, the rising sun sends a single beam of light down that passage, flooding the inner chamber with gold. The people who built this had no metal tools, no writing system, and certainly no calendar app. And they still managed an astronomical alignment that would make a modern engineer sweat, in a country where the sun barely shows its face twice a year. Picture the true scale of it. Newgrange spans roughly 85 meters across, ringed by massive curbstones, some weighing several tons apiece, many carved with spiraling patterns whose meaning has never been decoded. The builders hauled white quartz for the facing from mountains dozens of kilometers away, and darker stone from an entirely different direction, all without wheels, without carts, and without a single domesticated animal to help pull the load. They moved a small mountain of stone by hand, fitted together with astonishing care, and decorated it with art that still keeps modern scholars up at night. Now for the genuinely uncanny part. The passage isn't simply aimed at the front door catching a bit of morning light. Above the entrance sits a deliberately built opening, a roof box, added on purpose, through which the solstice sunrise travels the full length of the passage and lands precisely in the central chamber, illuminating the darkness for about 17 minutes before fatting. For the other 350-odd days of the year, that chamber sits in absolute black. On the coldest, darkest days of the year, it briefly fills with light. These builders engineered a structure to catch one sunbeam once a year, and they appear to have gotten it right, which is frankly more than can be said for most modern flat-pack furniture. Consider what that alignment actually required of them. A solstice sunrise can only be tested once annually. To get it exactly right, the builders had to track the sun's rising point across many winters, understand precisely where it would appear on the crucial morning, and then commit years of labor to constructing a massive stone corridor to intercept that single beam, all without any written reference to check their calculations against. They simply watched the sky, remembered what they saw, and built. And here is the quiet punchline to the whole story. For thousands of years after its builders vanished, Newgrange sat forgotten, mistaken by later generations for a natural hill, occasionally poked at by curious farmers. The solstice alignment, the entire reason the monument exists, wasn't confirmed by archaeologists until the 20th century, long after the people who understood it had turned to dust. An ancient civilization encoded a message in stone and sunlight, and it took humanity roughly 5,000 years to read it again. The people who raised Newgrange left behind no written laws to explain their world. The people who came after them, however, wrote laws about virtually everything, right down to who legally owned a wandering, trespassing bee. Long before English common law ever reached Irish shores, the island ran on something called the Brehon laws, a legal code so meticulous it makes modern tax legislation look almost relaxed by comparison. This system had little use for prisons. Instead, nearly every dispute came down to something called your honor price, a fixed monetary value attached to your personal dignity and standing. If someone wronged you, they simply paid it. And this is where things get genuinely strange. There were detailed, carefully reasoned rules about bee ownership, including who was entitled to a swarm that flew off and stung a neighbor, and how honey should be divided if your bees had been feeding on someone else's flowers the whole season. Cats had legal standing. So did your good name, your garden fence, and the exact standard of hospitality you owed to any stranger who showed up at your door. It was less a courtroom and more one very long, very detailed Irish argument, fully documented with receipts. Let's look closer at the honor price, because it really is the strange, beating heart of this entire legal world. Every free person in early Ireland carried a fixed monetary value tied directly to their rank and standing, and nearly every legal question in the whole system ran through that number. Insult a person of high status, and the fine was steep. Insult someone of lower status, and it was considerably lighter. Injure a person, break a promise to them, or damage their reputation, and the compensation owed was calculated straight from that fixed figure. Justice wasn't about locking someone away, it was about restoring balance to a ledger. In a very real sense, your personal dignity had a published exchange rate, and everyone in the community roughly knew what yours was worth. Now about those bees. The Brehon laws devote an entire section to beekeeping, and it is a genuine masterpiece of overthinking. If your bees crossed onto a neighbor's land to gather nectar, the reasoning went, then that neighbor had, in effect, contributed to your honey supply and was therefore owed a share of the swarm over time. If a swarm landed and settled in someone else's tree, there were rules to cover that too. If a person was stung by someone else's bee and hadn't previously killed a bee of his own in retaliation, there was a formula worked out for what was owed. An entire farming society sat down and formally legislated the flight patterns of insects. Somewhere, some long-forgotten legal scholar spent an entire career mastering the jurisprudence of buzzing. And it didn't stop with bees. There were laws covering cats, including the specific value of a particularly good mouser and what compensation was owed if one came to harm. There were laws for dogs, for the responsibilities of a farmer whose livestock wandered onto someone else's land, and for the precise quality of food a lord was legally obligated to provide his dependents. There were detailed hospitality laws, because refusing to properly feed and shelter a legitimate traveler wasn't just rude. It was a genuine legal offense that could cost you dearly. In a world without inns on every corner, being a bad host was practically a crime. What's most remarkable is that this whole system functioned, and functioned for centuries, without any central police force, and without a sprawling network of prisons. It relied instead on a professional class of legal experts, the Brehons, who memorized and interpreted this enormous body of law, and on the simple social pressure of small communities where everyone knew everyone's honor price and expected debts to be paid. It was arbitration on a national scale, run on reputation, cattle, and an almost obsessive love of detail. The Irish, in short, would cheerfully go to law over a single bee. So you can imagine what happened when the dispute wasn't a bee, but a bull. Because when it was a bull, the argument didn't stay confined to a courtroom. It became a war. Ireland's great ancient epic, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, gets compared constantly to Homer's Iliad. The key difference is that the Trojan War was fought over a stolen queen, and this one was fought over a bull. Queen Medb of Connaught, lying in bed one evening tallying up the household wealth with her husband, discovers that he owns one single bull more valuable than anything she possesses. Since she flatly refuses to be even slightly less wealthy than any man alive, including her own husband, she raises an entire army to march into a neighboring province and take a rival bull by force. Thousands of warriors march to war. A single teenage hero holds an entire invading army back almost single-handedly. Rivers run red with blood. And in the end, an argument about livestock somehow escalates into one of the bloodiest wars in Irish legend. Somewhere, Homer would have been quietly impressed. The spark that ignites the whole saga is one of the great masterpieces of pettiness in world literature. Medb and her husband Ailill lie in bed one night, comparing their possessions item by item to settle, once and for all, which of them is truly the wealthier partner. They match each other exactly, cauldron for cauldron, jewel for jewel, herd for herd, until it comes down to cattle, and their Ailill owns one magnificent bull that Medb simply cannot match. This is unbearable to her. Not because she has any practical need of the animal, but because equality isn't enough for her. She needs proof, publicly, that she is not the lesser partner in her own marriage. And so, over one bruised ego and a single beast, she sets an entire country into motion. Medb learns that the only bull in all of Ireland capable of rivaling her husband's prize is the great brown bull of Cooley, kept far off in the province of Ulster. She first tries simply to rent the animal, offering its owner a genuinely generous package of land, treasure, and by some tellings, her own personal favor. The deal very nearly succeeds. Then her messengers get drunk and loudly boast that if the owner had refused their offer, they would have simply taken the bull by force anyway. Word gets back to the owner, who understandably withdraws the deal entirely. So Medb does exactly what her men had drunkenly promised. She gathers a vast army from across the land and marches into Ulster to seize the bull through open war. Standing between her enormous host and the bull is a single young man, the warrior Cuchulainn, barely more than a boy, who holds the invaders at bay through weeks of single combat at a river ford. Thanks to an ancient curse laid upon the men of Ulster, the province's other warriors are left helpless, struck down by pains like those of childbirth at the very moment they're needed most, leaving the boy to fight on almost entirely alone. Day after day, he defeats Medb's champions one at a time, including, heartbreakingly, his own foster brother and closest friend, whom he is eventually forced to kill in single combat. The body count climbs into legend, all in defense of one bull. And what does this enormous war actually achieve? Medb's forces do eventually capture the brown bull of Cooley and haul it back to Connaught. In the narrowest possible sense, she wins. But then the captured bull meets Ailill's white-horned bull, the very animal that started this entire catastrophe, and the two beasts attack each other in a furious, blood-soaked frenzy, goring and trampling their way across the length of the country. The brown bull kills its rival, scatters pieces of the carcass across the landscape, and then, utterly spent, drops dead itself. Both prize animals are gone. Countless warriors are dead, and Medb is left with absolutely nothing to show for it, except an extremely expensive lesson in never comparing livestock at bedtime. That war had a queen at its center, a woman fierce enough to burn a country down over her own pride. She deserved, by any reasonable measure, a death worthy of all that fury. What she actually got was cheese. According to legend, Queen Medb was bathing in a pool one morning when her nephew, nursing a long and very specific family grudge, took aim at her with a sling. He didn't have a proper stone on hand, so he loaded a hardened lump of cured cheese instead and let it fly. It struck her squarely in the forehead and killed her instantly. One of the most feared and formidable figures in all of Irish mythology, brought down by a dairy product traveling at speed. It's the kind of ending nobody could possibly have invented on purpose, which is very likely exactly why someone did. The grudge behind it runs deep, as all the very best Irish family grudges tend to. The nephew's name was Ferbade, and Medb had been responsible for the death of his mother, who happened to be Medb's own sister, Clothra. In one version of this sprawling family drama, Ferbade was reportedly cut from his dying mother's body as she lay dying, an origin story practically engineered to produce a man with a lifelong score to settle. This was no random act of violence. It was a family matter that had simmered for years, and Ferbade had reportedly spent that time practicing, sharpening his aim against the day he might finally catch his aunt off guard. Some versions of the tale claim he trained using a piece of his mother's remains, hardened into a solid ball, slinging it again and again while he waited for his moment. Other versions simply say he became an extraordinary marksman through years of relentless, quiet practice. Either way, the message is the same: Ferbade was ready. He had turned his grief and his rage into a skill. He just needed Medb to stand still long enough, and eventually, inevitably, she did. The place was an island on a lake where Medb kept the habit of bathing each morning. Ferbade spotted her from the far shore in one version, while measuring the distance with a length of rope so he could be certain of his range. He loaded his sling, and here is the detail that has kept this story alive for well over 1,000 years. He had no proper stone to hand. What he had instead was a piece of hardened cheese, so he fired the cheese. It sailed across the water and struck the great queen precisely in the center of her forehead. And that was the end of Medb, ruler of Connaught, scourge of Ulster, the woman who had marched thousands of men to their deaths over a single bull, finally undone by a snack. There's something almost perfectly balanced about it. Medb spent her entire life measuring herself against everyone around her, refusing to be even slightly less than her husband, burning down the world rather than accept second place. And the poets who preserved her story gave her a death with absolutely no dignity in it whatsoever. No sword, no crown, no final speech, just a lump of cheese and a nephew with a long memory and a very good arm. It's worth remembering that the storytellers who passed this tale down through the centuries knew exactly what they were doing. Handing the proudest queen in all of Ireland the silliest death imaginable wasn't an accident. It was a punchline, delivered slowly, across generations. Medb went out on a piece of cheese. The young hero who had single-handedly held off her entire army, meanwhile, refused to go out lying down at all. He was determined to die on his feet, and he found a truly unforgettable way to manage it. Cuchulainn is Ireland's greatest mythical warrior, a man so terrifying in combat that his body was said to contort itself into something close to a spinning knot of fury before a fight even began. But it's his death that people remember longest of all. Mortally wounded and fully aware that his end had come, he refused to fall. He would not give his enemies the satisfaction of watching him collapse. So he dragged himself to a standing stone, strapped his own body upright against it using his belt, and faced the men who had come to finish him, staying vertical even as his life drained away. His enemies were so unsettled by the sight that they didn't dare approach for 3 full days. Only when a raven finally landed on his shoulder to feed did they believe, at last, that the man was truly gone. That isn't just stubbornness. That's a level of spite most of us can only dream of achieving. To really understand that final scene, You have to understand what came before it, something the old storytellers called the warp spasm, a monstrous transformation said to seize Cuchulainn in the heat of battle. His body would twist and distort, one eye bulging outward while the other sank deep into his skull, his muscles knotting beneath his skin, heat pouring off him so fiercely that snow was said to melt around his feet, and a jet of dark blood was said to rise from the crown of his head. Enemies who witnessed this transformation coming often simply lost the will to fight before the first blow ever landed. This wasn't a soldier anymore. This was closer to a natural disaster wearing a man's shape, and for years it had made him effectively unbeatable. His downfall came, in the end, not through any stronger warrior, but through the slow accumulation of curses, sacred obligations, and clever manipulation. Cuchulainn lived under a set of personal taboos, sacred prohibitions that, if broken, were said to invite ruin, and his enemies engineered a trap in which every single choice available to him meant violating one of those prohibitions. Cornered by his own code of honor, weakened and doomed no matter which path he chose, he was finally struck by a spear that dealt him a mortal wound. He knew, in that instant, that his story was ending. The only question left was how. And this is where his answer becomes legend. Rather than collapse where his enemies could gloat over a fallen champion, Cuchulainn dragged his failing body to a nearby standing stone, leaned against it, and lashed himself upright with his own belt so that he could remain standing even as death took him. He wanted to meet the end exactly as he had met every battle before it, on his feet, facing forward, weapon still in hand. His war horse, the Grey of Matcha, is said to have stayed loyally at his side, charging the gathering enemy 3 separate times in his defense, refusing to abandon its dying master even at the very end. For 3 days, his enemies watched from a careful distance, and not one of them dared come close. He was so feared, even wounded, bound, and clearly dying, that his mere silhouette was enough to freeze an entire army in place. They needed absolute certainty before they would move, and there was only one sign they would ultimately trust. Finally, the Morrigan, the goddess of war and fate, arrived in the form of a raven, or in some versions simply a hungry carrion crow, and settled onto his shoulder to feed. Carrion birds do not land on the living. Only then did his enemies finally accept that the great hound of Ulster was truly, finally gone. It remains one of the most striking images in all of Irish storytelling. A dead man still standing guard, still holding the field through reputation alone, defended by nothing but a stone at his back and an army too frightened to advance, right up until a single bird had to arrive to confirm what should have already been obvious. He died leaning against a standing stone. As it happens, Ireland has another famous upright stone, and this one was given an even stranger job than propping up a dying hero. This one was supposed to speak. On the hill of Tara, ancient seat of Ireland's high kings, stands a plain upright stone known as the lease, the stone of destiny. According to legend, it was carried to Ireland by a mysterious, otherworldly people, and it had exactly one duty, which it apparently took very seriously indeed. When the rightful king of Ireland placed his hands upon it, the stone would let out a great roar for all to hear, confirming him as the genuine, destined ruler. No roar, no crown. It functioned, in effect, as a Bronze Age lie detector for monarchs, and one considerably harder to bribe than most modern officials. The stone still stands on the hill to this day, weathered by time and completely silent, presumably because nothing that has wandered up there in the last 1,500 years has particularly impressed it. The mysterious people said to have brought the stone were the Tuatha Dé Danann, the godlike race of Irish mythology, said to have arrived in Ireland carrying 4 great treasures out of 4 legendary otherworldly cities. One was a spear said to guarantee victory in any battle. One was a sword no enemy could ever escape. One was a cauldron that never once left anyone hungry. And the fourth was the Lia Fail, the stone that would cry out beneath the feet of the true and rightful king. Of these 4 treasures, the stone alone is said to have remained in Ireland, planted firmly at the ceremonial heart of Irish kingship, transforming the crowning of a monarch from a matter of pure politics into a matter of sound. Consider how convenient and how genuinely terrifying that arrangement must have felt to anyone hopping to seize power. In most of the ancient world, becoming king came down to who commanded the largest army, who held the strongest bloodline claim, or who had simply outlived the most rivals. And the ceremony that followed was little more than theater, designed to make the outcome look official. At Tara, according to legend, that theater had teeth. A would-be king could gather every soldier and every ally in the land, march to the top of the sacred hill and place his hands on the stone, and if he wasn't truly meant to rule, the stone would simply stay silent, in full view of everyone watching. There was no arguing with it, no quiet word whispered in its ear, no bag of gold that could change its verdict. Either it roared for you, or your coronation became deeply, publicly awkward. Tara itself was the perfect stage for a test like this. It wasn't a fortress in the conventional sense, but a vast ceremonial landscape, a complex of ancient mounds and enclosures that served as the symbolic heart of the entire island, a place where kingship itself was thought to be rooted in the earth. Kings were made there, great assemblies gathered there, and the hill carried a weight of sacred importance far beyond its modest height. A stone that judged kings belonged exactly there, standing at the meeting point between the earthly world and the other world, where the line between political ceremony and supernatural test was always meant to stay thin. There's a lovely footnote to the stone's later story. Because it became such a powerful symbol of legitimate rule, other places across the wider Gaelic world wanted a connection to it too, and rival traditions grew up elsewhere claiming links to the crowning of kings well beyond Ireland's shores. Amid all these competing claims, the Irish naturally insisted their stone was the true and original one, and that it had remained exactly where it belonged, standing on the hill. And there it remains today, a plain, weathered pillar gathering equal parts weather and curious tourists. Whether it ever truly roared for anyone is not something history can settle for us. What we can say with confidence is that it has been remarkably quiet for a very, very long time, which the more cynical among us might read as a fairly pointed comment on the quality of everyone who has climbed that hill since. That same otherworldly race is credited with gifting Ireland roaring stones and magic cauldrons. Unfortunately, the very same otherworld also seems to have supplied a few things that really should have stayed buried, and did not. Everyone gives Transylvania the credit, but Ireland was doing the undead centuries earlier. In the folklore of County Derry, there's the tale of the Abhartach, a cruel little chieftain and reputed sorcerer who died, was properly buried, and then had the sheer audacity to claw his way back out of his own grave, demanding a bowl of blood from his terrified subjects every single night. They killed him again. He came back again. They killed him a third time. He came back a third time. Eventually, a wise man was consulted, and he laid out the rules. The creature could only be stopped by killing him with a sword forged from yew wood, burying him upside down in the earth, and pinning him beneath a heavy stone surrounded by scattered thorns. The villagers followed the instructions to the letter, and this time, at last, it held. The spot is reportedly still marked on local maps today, and locals will tell you with a perfectly straight face that the ground there has never quite felt right since. In the original telling, the Abhartach was a tyrant even while alive, a small, physically deformed chieftain who ruled through fear and was widely believed to dabble in dark magic. He was hated, which in a small, tightly knit community is a genuinely dangerous thing to be, and eventually another local chieftain was persuaded to kill him and be done with the matter for good. He was duly slain and buried standing upright, in the manner befitting a lord of his rank, and everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief. That relief lasted exactly one night. The following morning, the Abhartach reappeared, very much active, and demanded that his subjects each open a vein and fill a bowl with their own blood to sustain him. This is the detail that has earned him his modern reputation, because a dead nobleman rising from the grave specifically to drink the blood of the living is, whatever else you might call it, extremely on brand for a vampire. The chieftain who had killed him tried again, striking the creature down a second time and burying him once more. And once more, the Abhartach clawed his way back to the surface and resumed his nightly demands. This is the part of the story that feels strikingly modern, the horror of an enemy who simply will not stay defeated, who returns again and again no matter what is done to stop him. In desperation, the chieftain sought out a holy man, or in some versions a druid, someone who understood the deeper rules governing such things, and asked how the creature could finally be stopped for good. The instructions he received are wonderfully, almost bureaucratically specific, reading like the terms and conditions of the supernatural. The creature could never truly be killed, only restrained. He had to be slain using a sword carved from the wood of a yew tree, then buried head downward, upside down in the earth, so that he could never dig his way back toward the surface. A great stone had to be placed on top of the grave to hold him in position, and thorns scattered around the site to bind him further still. Only once every single condition had been met would the Abhartach finally be held fast beneath the ground. The chieftain followed the instructions exactly, and this time it worked. The upside-down burial, the heavy capstone, the ring of thorns, together they kept the creature pinned in place. And here the legend brushes right up against the real landscape, because there is a specific spot in the countryside long associated with precisely this story, marked by an old stone and a nearby tree, a place locals have historically been deeply reluctant to disturb. Attempts to clear the site, according to local accounts, have always gone badly, in exactly the way these things tend to. So Ireland had its own blood-drinking, grave-climbing undead lord in local folklore long before any novelist made the concept world-famous. And the strange thing is that later novelists may owe Ireland far more credit than the world usually gives it. Here's the part vampire fans don't always enjoy hearing. Bram Stoker, the man who wrote Dracula, wasn't from Eastern Europe at all. He was a Dubliner born in Clontarf, who spent a sickly, bedridden childhood listening to his mother's grim stories of plague and death in the west of Ireland. He never once set foot in Transylvania in his entire life, and there is a persistent, disputed but genuinely delicious theory that the name Dracula itself may echo the Irish phrase Drac F. Hola, meaning bad blood. Whether Stoker deliberately borrowed the phrase, or simply had it rattling around somewhere in the back of his mind from childhood, nobody has ever been able to prove. But it raises a wonderful possibility that the most famous vampire on Earth may have been dreamed up by a nervous Irishman who drew most of his atmosphere from childhood bedtime stories about disease and bogs. Let's start with that childhood, because it explains a great deal. Stoker was born in 1847 and was so frail in his earliest years that he couldn't walk, spending much of his boyhood confined to bed. His mother, Charlotte, filled those long hours with stories, and hers were not gentle ones. She had personally lived through a cholera epidemic in the west of Ireland, and she told her bedridden son vivid, horrifying accounts of the disease, of mass death, and most chillingly of all, of people being buried before they were truly dead, in the panic to halt the spread of contagion. A small, immobile child lying in the dark, absorbing tale after tale of premature burial and bodies that might not be entirely finished with life. It's hard to imagine a more efficient way to raise a horror writer. Then there's the matter of research. The popular image is of Stoker steeping himself deeply in the folklore of a distant Transylvania, and it's true that he read historical accounts of the region and borrowed both its geography and a genuine historical name for his count. But he built his monster from a desk in England and never once traveled to the Carpathian Mountains. His instinct for dread, for the uncanny, for the dead who refuse to lie still, seems to have come from far closer to home, from an Irish storytelling tradition absolutely saturated with restless spirits, death omens, and creatures like the Abhartach, who claw their way out of the grave to feed. The scenery of Dracula was borrowed from Eastern Europe. The bones underneath it, some argue, were thoroughly Irish. The name itself is where the theory becomes irresistible. The mainstream explanation is that Dracula derives from a real medieval nobleman whose family name meant son of the dragon, or son of the one called Dracul, and that Stoker simply lifted an authentic, suitably sinister-sounding title straight out of a history book. That's very likely the true origin of the name. But running alongside it is the far more seductive Irish theory that the sound of Drac Efhola, meaning bad or evil blood, was already floating somewhere in Stoker's ear from his native tongue, and quietly shaped his attraction to the name he eventually chose. For a novel that is, at its core, entirely about tainted, dangerous, transmissible blood, an accidental Irish pun meaning bad blood feels almost too perfect to be pure coincidence. Serious scholars will caution you correctly that there's no hard proof Stoker consciously reached for the Irish phrase, and that the documented historical origin of the name is far better supported by the evidence. This is not a settled fact. It's a tantalizing maybe, the kind of detail that could be a genuine hidden root, or could simply be a delightful coincidence dressed up by people who badly want it to be true. But honestly, that ambiguity feels very Irish in itself. A Dublin-born author, raised on his mother's plague nightmares, writes the definitive vampire novel of the modern era without ever visiting the country it's set in, and leaves behind a title that might secretly mean bad blood in his own native language. Nobody can confirm it. Nobody can quite kill the theory either. And so, like a good vampire, it simply refuses to die. Stoker conjured his monsters purely from imagination and childhood dread. But some of the strangest things the Irish ever produced were not imagined at all. They were built, entirely by hand, in what might be the least sensible location anyone has ever chosen to live. Off the wild coast of County Kerry, a jagged pyramid of stone stabs straight up out of the raging Atlantic. This is Skellig Michael, and sometime around the 6th century, a small group of monks looked at this soaking, wind-battered rock rising out of the ocean and thought, yes, this is exactly where I would like to spend the rest of my life. They climbed it. They carved roughly 600 stone steps directly into the cliff face by hand. And they built small, beehive-shaped huts of dry stone that have now survived nearly 14 centuries of relentless Atlantic storms without a single drop of mortar holding them together. They grew vegetables in tiny gardens perched above sheer drops, collected rainwater to survive, and prayed while the sea did everything in its power to remove them from the rock entirely. Modern visitors arrive by boat, take one look at the climb ahead of them, and quietly begin reconsidering several of their recent life choices. The monks did the whole thing barefoot, in the rain, deliberately, for God. To really grasp how extreme this choice was, you have to picture the location honestly. Skellig Michael isn't a cozy little island with a sheltered harbor waiting to welcome you. It's a bare, jagged crag of rock rising steeply out of some of the roughest water in Europe, more than 11 kilometers from the mainland, lashed constantly by wind and salt spray, and frequently cut off entirely for weeks at a time when the sea simply refuses to let any boat land. There's no real soil to speak of, no natural shelter from the elements, and no easy source of food anywhere nearby. Anyone standing safely on the mainland, looking out at that rock, would reasonably conclude that no human being could possibly live there. The monks looked at that same forbidding rock and read it as an invitation. This was the logic of early Irish monasticism taken to its absolute furthest extreme. These men were pursuing a life of extreme hardship and total isolation as an act of devotion, deliberately seeking out the harshest, loneliest places they could possibly find in order to strip life down to nothing but prayer and endurance. Comfort was the enemy. Suffering was, in a very real sense, the entire point. And so, rather than settle somewhere sensible, a small community chose the single most punishing scrap of rock on the western edge of the known world, and set about making it livable through sheer, stubborn, relentless labor. And that labor really was staggering. They cut hundreds of individual steps directly into the living rock, so they could climb between the landing points and the summit, a narrow stairway clinging to sheer cliff faces with nothing but empty air and crashing ocean below. Near the top, they built their monastery, a tight cluster of dry stone huts, shaped like stone beehives, fitted together so skillfully, without any mortar whatsoever, that they've remained dry and standing through 14 centuries of the worst weather the Atlantic could possibly throw at them. They built retaining walls, narrow terraces, systems to collect rainwater, and small gardens to coax a handful of vegetables out of almost nothing at all. Every single stone was placed by hand, in howling wind, on a narrow ledge above a lethal drop. Life up there is almost impossible to romanticize honestly. The monks endured constant damp, ferocious storms, and long stretches of total isolation, surviving on fish, seabirds, eggs, and whatever meager crops they could coax from the rock. And for added excitement, Viking raiders are recorded as having attacked the settlement more than once, because apparently living on a hostile spike of rock in the freezing North Atlantic wasn't quite dangerous enough without armed men occasionally arriving by boat to make things considerably worse. And still, the community held on for roughly 600 years before finally retreating to the mainland, as the climate worsened and monastic customs shifted with the times. There's a neat modern footnote to all of this. This unimaginably remote place of ancient hardship became, in recent years, a filming location for a hugely famous science fiction saga, which means millions of people around the world now instantly recognize the silhouette of Skellig Michael without having the faintest idea that real men once starved, froze, and prayed up there for centuries on end. The monks wanted, more than anything, to be forgotten by the world. Instead, they became a backdrop. Centuries before Columbus ever set sail, an Irish monk named Brendan supposedly climbed into a boat made of wood and stitched ox hides, and set off across the open Atlantic in search of paradise. The medieval account of his voyage reads like something out of a fever dream: islands wreathed in fire, a sea monster, a floating crystal pillar, and a small island where the monks landed to light a cooking fire, only for the entire island to shudder and swim away beneath their feet, because it turned out to be a whale all along. For a very long time, this story was filed firmly under tall tale. Then, in the 1970s, an adventurer built a boat to the exact medieval Irish design, out of nothing but wood and stitched leather, and actually sailed it from Ireland all the way to Newfoundland. It floated. It arrived. Which means the story about the whale might be the only part we still get to comfortably laugh at. The tale comes down to us through a medieval text describing the voyage of Saint Brendan the Navigator, a real historical monk who lived in the 6th century and founded monasteries across Ireland. According to the account, Brendan gathered a small crew of fellow monks and set out to find the Isle of the Blessed, a paradise said to lie somewhere far out in the Western Ocean. What follows is a 7-year sea journey of the most extraordinary kind. Part pilgrimage and part fairy tale, in which the monks drift from one impossible island to the next, encountering wonders and terrors in roughly equal measure, before finally reaching their promised land and sailing home to tell the tale. Some of the wonders in the account are pure fantasy, pure marvel, but others have a strangely plausible ring to them once you squint at them properly. The island that turned out to be a living whale, which the monks apparently named and returned to visit each year, is obviously a good campfire story, but other episodes carry an odd whiff of reported truth. The monks describe an island of fire, where the inhabitants hurled molten rock at their boat, which sounds a great deal like an eyewitness account of a volcanic eruption in Iceland. They describe a towering crystal pillar floating in the sea, wrapped in what sounds like a silvery mesh, which reads uncannily like a close encounter with an iceberg. A medieval Irish monk inventing details like these purely from imagination would be genuinely impressive. A medieval Irish monk describing things he had actually witnessed on a real northern Atlantic crossing would explain them perfectly. That gap between fable and real geography is exactly what drew a modern adventurer named Tim Severin into the story centuries later. He reasoned that the only real way to test whether the voyage was even possible was to attempt it himself, in a vessel the 6th century monks could genuinely have built and used. So he constructed one faithfully, using a wooden frame covered in tanned, stitched ox hide sealed with wool grease, the traditional Irish design known as a curragh, simply scaled up for the open ocean. Plenty of people assumed a leather boat would rot, swamp, or fall apart entirely somewhere out in the deep Atlantic. It did none of those things. Severin and his small crew sailed that hide-covered boat out from Ireland, by way of the Hebrides, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland, and on across the freezing North Atlantic, eventually reaching Newfoundland on the coast of North America. The route wasn't chosen at random. It followed a chain of northern islands, a kind of natural stepping stone path that closely matched the landmarks described in Brendan's original tale. And along the way, the crew encountered their own versions of the legend's wonders, including whales surfacing close beside the little boat, and drifting pack ice and icebergs in the far north. The leather held together. The voyage proved genuinely survivable. Paradise, of course, was never actually proven to exist, but the crossing itself absolutely was. None of this proves that Brendan himself truly reached the shores of the Americas centuries before Columbus. It proves something arguably even more interesting, that he could have. That the technology and the seamanship required genuinely existed at the time, and that the strangest, most seemingly fantastical details of a story long dismissed as pure myth turned out to describe the real North Atlantic with uncomfortable accuracy. Brendan's monks left behind almost nothing but a story. Other Irish monasteries left something far more solid and far more genuinely puzzling, standing tall in fields all across the country, and to this day, nobody is entirely sure why it's there. Dotted across the Irish landscape are more than 100 tall, impossibly slender stone towers, narrow as pencils and often standing over 30 meters high, each with a single doorway placed strangely far off the ground. They were built by early Christian monasteries roughly 1,000 years ago, and here's the genuinely awkward part. Nobody is entirely certain why. The popular explanation is that they served as refuges during Viking raids, somewhere to stash both the monks and their treasure, pulling the latter up behind them for safety. But others point out that these towers make genuinely terrible fortresses, being essentially tall, hollow stone chimneys, and suggest instead that they functioned as bell towers, landmarks, or elaborate status symbols. The honest truth is that an entire civilization left dozens of enormous, expensive stone structures standing across the island, and 1,000 years later, we're all still politely guessing at their purpose. Look closely at one, and the mystery only deepens further. A typical round tower is a smooth, gently tapering cylinder of finely fitted stone, rising in a way that looks almost impossibly graceful for its age, capped with a sharp conical stone roof like a sharpened pencil tip. The detail everyone notices immediately is the door, which sits not at ground level, but several meters up the side of the tower, reachable only by a ladder. Inside, the tower was divided into several wooden floors connected by more ladders, each level lit by a single small window, with a cluster of larger windows near the very top. They are beautiful, deliberate, and clearly expensive to build, which tells us that the monastic communities who raised them cared a great deal about getting the design exactly right. That raised doorway sits right at the heart of the whole debate. To defense-minded observers, the logic seems obvious. Raise the entrance, keep a ladder stored inside, and when raiders appear on the horizon, climb up, haul the ladder in behind you, and simply wait it out behind solid stone walls with your relics and your gold safely out of reach. In an age when Viking longships genuinely did sail up Irish rivers looking for exactly the kind of portable wealth a monastery tended to hold, a tall stone strongpoint sounds like plain common sense, and the general timing does broadly fit. since many of these towers went up during the centuries of coastal raiding. But the skeptics have a frustratingly strong case of their own. A tall, narrow tower with a single wooden interior and one high entrance is, if anything, a genuine death trap under any serious siege. Attackers wouldn't even need to break in. They would only need to set a fire at the base, and the entire hollow column would act like a chimney flue, drawing flames and smoke straight upward through those wooden floors, with anyone sheltering inside effectively cooked alive. There are historical records of towers burning down with people trapped inside them. As a last-ditch panic room against a quick smash-and-grab raid, a round tower might buy a community a bit of time. But as a serious, considered defensive structure, it's close to useless, and the monks who built these towers were certainly not fools. So the leading alternative theory points towards something far more mundane. The Irish name for these towers translates roughly as bell house, which strongly suggests their main everyday purpose was simply to hold a bell and call the surrounding community to prayer, their height helping carry the sound across the countryside. Others emphasize that they would also have served as unmistakable landmarks, visible for many miles around, guiding travelers and pilgrims toward the monastery and openly announcing its importance and wealth to anyone approaching from a distance. A grand tower was, in a sense, a statement, a way of declaring this is a place of real significance, written in stone tall enough to be seen from the horizon. The likeliest answer is probably that these towers were all of these things at once. A tower can ring a bell, mark a site, store valuables, welcome a visitor, and offer brief emergency refuge, all without needing to pick just one single job to justify its existence. Ancient buildings rarely served one tidy purpose. What's certain is that these towers were the work of a confident, highly skilled, deeply religious society. That same devout society could also, on occasion, carve things onto the walls of its holiest buildings that leave modern visitors thoroughly blushing. If you happen to glance up at certain very old Irish churches and castles, you may notice a small stone carving of a woman, and then immediately wish you had kept your eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead instead. These are Sheila na gigs, grotesque female figures displaying themselves in a manner that can only be described as anatomically enthusiastic, carved directly into the walls of otherwise entirely holy buildings. Nobody fully agrees on why they're there at all. Some say they were meant to ward off evil and death itself. Others insist they were fertility symbols. Still others claim they were a stern warning against the sin of lust, which feels like a fairly bold strategy given that the carving itself does the precise opposite of discouraging anyone from looking. They have survived on sacred walls for centuries now, quietly baffling every absent-minded tourist who happens to glance upward. Let's be clear about what these carvings actually are, because delicacy will only confuse the matter further. A Sheila na gig is a stone figure of a naked woman, usually squat and stylized rather than lifelike, with an exaggerated head, a gaunt body, and both hands reaching down to hold herself open in a frank, unmistakable, and thoroughly deliberate display. They are not subtle. They are not tucked away in some forgotten corner. Many of them were placed high on church walls, directly over doorways and windows, in exactly the kind of prominent position where you would ordinarily expect to find a saint or a sacred symbol, and instead you find this. For an object so genuinely common on medieval religious buildings across Ireland and Britain, it's remarkable how thoroughly it refuses to behave the way church decoration is supposed to behave. The first great puzzle is why an image like this would appear on a Christian church at all. One popular explanation holds that these figures functioned as protective grotesques, meant to frighten away evil spirits, misfortune, or death itself, in the same broad family as the gargoyles and monstrous faces carved onto churches all across medieval Europe. The idea is that something shocking and confronting, placed directly at a threshold, could guard the people passing safely beneath it, and that the raw, unfiltered nature of the Sheila was precisely the point. A kind of supernatural alarm system, carved permanently in stone. A second explanation points in almost the opposite direction entirely, toward fertility and life rather than warding and death. In this reading, the Sheela na gig is an ancient symbol of birth, of the raw female power to bring forth new life, possibly rooted in far older pre-Christian traditions that were quietly absorbed into the new religion rather than stamped out by it. Some carvings were reportedly touched or rubbed by women hopping for children or for a safe childbirth, which suggests that at least in certain times and certain places, these figures were regarded not with horror at all, but with genuine hope, as sources of blessing rather than threats to be feared. Then there is the moralizing theory, which holds that the carvings were intended purely as a warning against sin and lust, a grotesque visual reminder of the corruption of the flesh, meant to steer the faithful firmly toward virtue. This is the interpretation that has always sat most awkwardly of the three, because a startling, explicit image of exposed female anatomy seems like a genuinely strange choice for something meant to discourage anyone from thinking along those lines in the first place. If the goal truly was to promote chastity, mounting a vivid nude directly over the church door was, at absolute best, a high-risk approach to the problem. The frustrating and entirely honest answer is that we simply do not know for certain, and it's entirely possible that different carvings meant genuinely different things to different communities, spread across the many centuries in which they were made. The tradition itself is old, the surviving records are thin, and the people who once understood exactly what these figures were meant to represent never bothered to write it down for us. What we do know, quite clearly, is that the Irish had a long-standing habit of keeping strange and startling things in and around their holiest places. Sometimes it was a carving on a wall. Sometimes, remarkably, it was an entire human head. In a church in Drogheda, sealed inside a tall and rather ornate glass case, sits the blackened, shrunken, roughly 3.5-century-old head of a man named Oliver Plunkett. He was an archbishop, executed in London in 1681 on charges that were, by any honest reading, entirely fabricated. After the grim business was finished, his supporters quietly rescued various parts of his body to preserve as holy relics. His head eventually made its way to Drogheda, where it remains on full public display to this very day, gazing calmly out at a steady stream of pilgrims and the occasional startled tourist who wandered in expecting stained glass windows, and instead came face to face with a preserved human skull. He was later formally recognized as a saint. His head, meanwhile, has quietly become one of the more unusual tourist attractions in the entire country. And yes, you absolutely can go and see him for yourself. Oliver Plunkett was a genuine, well-documented historical figure, not a piece of folklore. He served as the Catholic Archbishop of Armagh during a period when holding that office was a genuinely dangerous thing to do, working tirelessly to keep his church functioning through a stretch of intense religious persecution across Ireland. By every account, he was a conscientious, hard-working clergyman, ministering to his flock, ordaining new priests, and trying to hold his community together under enormous, sustained pressure. His downfall came not through anything he actually did, but through a wave of anti-Catholic hysteria sweeping through England at the time, fueled by fabricated plots and professional liars looking to profit from public panic. He was swept up in the paranoia surrounding a supposed conspiracy, arrested, and put on trial for treason, on charges that essentially amounted to plotting a foreign invasion of England. The evidence against him was little more than a tissue of perjury from thoroughly unreliable witnesses, and the entire proceeding was so transparently rigged that his trial had to be relocated to England specifically to guarantee a conviction, because no honest Irish jury would ever have delivered the verdict the authorities wanted. He was found guilty and sentenced to the appalling traitor's death of the age, hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment deliberately designed to be as brutal and degrading as human cruelty could devise. He is said to have met his end with a calm, forgiving dignity that reportedly impressed even openly hostile onlookers. After the execution, his remains were recovered by loyal supporters who regarded him as a genuine martyr, and this is precisely where the relic tradition takes over. In an age when the physical remains of holy people were treasured as sacred objects, capable of inspiring the faithful, and some believed of working miracles, the pieces of Plunkett's body became genuinely precious. Over time, his remains were divided and honored in various locations, and his head, remarkably well preserved, eventually made its way to St. Peter's Church in Drogheda, where it was formally enshrined for public veneration. And there it sits to this very day, displayed inside an elaborate case surrounded by the full trappings of devotion. The face is dark and withered by the passing centuries, unmistakably a human head, resting quietly in an ornate golden shrine. For believers, it remains a profound and deeply moving relic, a direct physical link to a man who died for his faith and was later formally recognized by the church as a saint. For the casual visitor wandering in off the street, it is one of the more genuinely startling things you can encounter on an ordinary afternoon, a real severed head, centuries old, calmly on display in the middle of a working parish church. It's a very particular kind of Irish attraction, solemn and macabre in equal measure, entirely sincere, and entirely astonishing all at once. Plunkett's head was preserved out of pure reverence, kept safe by people who genuinely loved him. Not every famous set of Irish remains was treated quite so kindly. One man spent his final days desperately trying to keep his own bones out of a museum display case and failed utterly. Charles Byron was born in the 1760s and grew to a towering height of around 7.5 feet, which made him an overnight sensation in London, where paying crowds lined up to gawk at the man they called the Irish Giant. Byron knew that a famous surgeon of the day was circling him like a shopper eyeing a rare bargain, desperate to get his hands on that enormous skeleton for study. Byron was so thoroughly horrified by the prospect that he left extremely detailed instructions for what should happen after his death. His body was to be sealed inside a lead coffin and buried at sea, well out of anyone's reach. The surgeon simply bribed the funeral party, quietly swapped the body for a load of stones, and boiled poor Byron down into a bare skeleton. That skeleton then stood proudly in a glass case inside a London museum for more than 2 full centuries, in flat, open defiance of the man's very clearly stated final wish. Byron's extraordinary height, which we now understand was caused by a tumor affecting the gland that regulates human growth, made him a genuine celebrity in an era hungry for human curiosities of every kind. He traveled to London and put himself on public display, charging visitors for the privilege of marveling at his size, and for a while he was very much the talk of the city, a genuine living giant walking among ordinary people. But fame of that particular kind proved to be a fragile thing. His health declined steadily. He reportedly turned to heavy drinking, and it soon became painfully clear that this remarkable young man was not going to live a long life. He was still only in his early 20s. What tormented him most as the end drew near wasn't death itself, but the fear of what would happen to his body afterward. This was the golden age of anatomical science, when ambitious surgeons and private collectors competed fiercely for unusual corpses to dissect and put on display, and a skeleton as genuinely rare as Byron's represented a prize beyond price. One prominent surgeon in particular had made his interest in Byron's remains brutally plain, and Byron knew exactly what awaited his body if that man ever managed to get his hands on it. The thought of being boiled down, wired together, and permanently mounted as a museum specimen filled him with genuine dread. So Byron made careful, deliberate arrangements to prevent exactly that outcome. According to surviving accounts, he asked that upon his death his body be closely watched over until it could be sealed inside a heavy lead coffin, carried out to the coast, and sunk at sea, safely beyond the reach of any ambitious collector. It was a thoughtful, specific plan, the plan of a man who understood precisely the threat he faced and tried, with his very last wishes, to guarantee himself the simple dignity of finally resting in peace. It should have worked perfectly. It did not. The surgeon, determined to have that skeleton by any means necessary, is said to have bribed the men entrusted with carrying the coffin. While Byron's body lay in their temporary care, they secretly removed it and quietly replaced its weight with stones and other ballast, so that the sealed coffin eventually lowered into the sea contained no giant at all. The real body was spirited away to the surgeon, who reduced it methodically to bare bone and added the completed skeleton to his private collection. Everything Byron had feared and specifically tried with all his remaining strength to prevent was carried out anyway, against his explicit dying wish, by the very people he had trusted to protect him. For more than 2 centuries afterward, Byron's skeleton remained on public display in a London museum, gazed upon by generation after generation of curious visitors, the exact fate he had begged in his final days to avoid. In more recent years, growing unease about the ethics of continuing to display his remains against his clearly documented wishes has led to renewed public debate about whether he should finally be allowed to rest. The argument over what is truly owed to a man who asked for so little has continued long after everyone directly involved in wronging him has themselves passed into history. Byron's story is a genuinely grim one, a living person quietly reduced to an object. But Georgian Ireland produced darker figures still, people who did not merely have things done to them, but who did the harming themselves. In Georgian Dublin, there lived a woman named Dorcas Kelly, better known simply as Darky Kelly, who ran a busy and well-known brothel called the Maiden Tower on Copper Alley. In 1760, she was convicted of murdering a local shoemaker, and when the authorities went on to search her premises, they reportedly discovered the bodies of 5 men hidden away in the vaults beneath the building. She was executed in the early days of 1761, using the grim, doubled method of the age, and afterward the working women of Dublin defiantly seized her body and staged a public wake in her honor, an act of open solidarity that resulted in 13 of them being arrested for their trouble. Over the centuries that followed, she was remembered first as a witch, then as a restless ghost, and only quite recently reconsidered as what she may genuinely have been all along. One of the very earliest documented serial killers in Irish history. Her name today, rather fittingly, belongs to a Dublin pub. Kelly was a real woman living in a real place, which is worth stressing clearly, because so much of what now surrounds her story has drifted deep into legend over time. What the historical records actually support is that she operated the Maiden Tower, a well-known brothel tucked into the maze of narrow streets on Dublin's south side, and that she was a woman of considerable local notoriety, living in an age when women in her particular trade were widely despised and treated as a genuine threat to public order and public morality. She would have existed under constant suspicion and open contempt, exactly the sort of person a court of the time would be quick to condemn and remarkably slow to believe. The charge that ultimately sent her to her death was the murder of a shoemaker named John Dowling, said to have been killed on St. Patrick's Day. She was tried, convicted, and sentenced, and the punishment handed down was genuinely horrific. She was executed by being partially hanged and then burned, a method of killing reserved for particularly damning cases and carried out publicly, as a deliberate spectacle for the crowd. It was a savage end, made even worse by the moral fervor of the era, which was primed and eager to see a brothel keeper as the very embodiment of vice, and to hand down the harshest possible verdict available to the court. The detail that has fascinated people ever since is exactly what investigators are said to have found when they searched her brothel afterward: the corpses of 5 men, hidden away in the vaults beneath the building itself. If true, and the surviving sources here blur uncomfortably between documented fact and later embellished retelling, it transforms Kelly from a woman who killed once into something far more chilling, a predator who had apparently been quietly disposing of victims and concealing them beneath her own premises for some time. It's precisely this discovery that has led modern historians to reconsider her as possibly the very first recorded female serial killer in Irish history, a startling reframing of a woman long dismissed as merely a criminal, or worse, a monster of pure folklore, because folklore certainly did get its hands on her story, and thoroughly. The most colorful surviving version claims she was executed not for murder at all, but for witchcraft, tangled up with a powerful nobleman, a stolen child, and a full satanic ritual, the entire Gothic package delivered at once. Careful modern research has largely picked this version apart, showing that the witchcraft tale appears to be a later, dramatic embellishment layered over the real, better documented case of a convicted murderer. The truth, in other words, was already dramatic enough without any demons involved, and the demons were added anyway, because that is simply what happens to a story like hers over 2.5 centuries of retelling. Her death did produce one genuinely striking, well-documented scene. After the execution, the working women of Dublin streets are said to have taken her remains and staged a proper public wake in open defiance of the authorities, a show of solidarity that ended with over a dozen of them arrested on the spot. Whatever she truly was, they claimed her firmly as one of their own. Kelly ran with a rough crowd in a genuinely hard city, but the single most notorious gathering of dangerous men in all of Georgian Ireland met not in a brothel, but in a lonely stone building perched on a hilltop, and their reputation, if anything, has grown blacker still with time. On a lonely hill above Dublin stands a squat, roofless stone building with a genuinely dreadful reputation. In the 1730s, this building became the meeting place of the Irish Hellfire Club, a gang of bored, wealthy young men who gathered up there regularly to drink, gamble, and behave as scandalously as their considerable fortunes would allow. Naturally, the stories surrounding them grew wilder with every retelling. Locals whispered of black masses held in secret, of a chair kept permanently empty and waiting for the devil himself, and of a card game that ended the very instant a player dropped a card, bent down to retrieve it, and noticed that the charming stranger seated across the table had cloven hooves where his feet should have been. There is even a persistent tale of a sacrificed black cat, and a priest specially summoned to cleanse the building afterward. Whatever actually happened up on that hill, the building still glowers down over the city to this day, and people still climb it after dark to dare each other to stay a little longer than they'd like. The building itself carries an unsettling origin story that set the tone for everything that followed. It was originally constructed as a hunting lodge on the summit of Montpelier Hill, on a spot that already carried an air of the uncanny about it, and the builders reportedly used stone taken from an ancient burial mound and a ruined nearby structure to raise its walls. In a country where interfering with old sacred sites was widely believed to invite serious misfortune, this was practically asking for trouble. Sure enough, when a great storm tore the original roof clean off the lodge not long after it was completed, the locals had no doubt whatsoever about the cause. The old powers of the hill were displeased, and the place had been marked as cursed from the very start. Into this brooding lodge came the Hellfire Club, an association of privileged rakes drawn from the wealthiest and most idle men of the era. Clubs of this general kind existed in various forms across the period, and their appeal lay squarely in transgression, in doing loudly and deliberately the exact things respectable society strictly forbade. Heavy drinking, high-stakes gambling, and general debauchery formed the main business of these gatherings, and the members cultivated a deliberate air of wicked defiance, delighting in shocking the pious and flouting every rule of decent, respectable behavior. Much of it was very probably youthful excess, dressed up to seem far more sinister than it truly was. But the reputation, once firmly earned, took on a life entirely of its own, and the stories that grew up around these men are genuinely magnificent. The most famous concerns a game of cards played late into the night, when one member of the company dropped a card and reached beneath the table to retrieve it. There, in the flickering candlelight, he glanced down at the feet of the mysterious, elegantly dressed stranger who had joined their game that evening, and saw, instead of shoes and stockings, a pair of cloven hooves. The devil himself, so the tale goes, had been sitting at their table the entire time, and the sheer horror of the discovery sent the players scattering in terror into the night. It's a perfect campfire story, the polished, well-traveled kind, and versions of essentially the same tale attach themselves to gambling dens across many different countries and centuries. But the Hellfire Club on that particular hill claimed it just as thoroughly as any of them. Other legends pile on top of this one without end. There's the tale of a cat, or some other unfortunate animal, sacrificed in a blasphemous ritual, and an account of the entire lodge being set ablaze on one particularly wild night, with several men trapped helplessly inside. There are whispers of black masses and mock ceremonies, of a seat permanently reserved for a dark and honored guest, of unspeakable acts committed for sport by men with far too much money and far too little fear of consequence. How much of this reflects genuine cruelty, and how much is pure later embroidery, is essentially impossible to untangle now. But the members of the club certainly worked hard to appear thoroughly damned, and the surrounding countryside proved more than willing to believe every word of it. Today, the roofless shell of the lodge still crowns the hill, a genuinely eerie ruin with equally genuine, sweeping views, drawing casual walkers by day and dedicated thrill-seekers by night. It has become one of the most reliably haunted spots in the entire country, precisely because its real, documented history and its wilder folklore have grown together so tightly that no one can fully separate the two anymore. The Hellfire Club flirted openly with the diabolical purely for entertainment and social standing. Elsewhere in Ireland, accusations of genuine dealings with dark forces were no game whatsoever, and for a number of ordinary women, those accusations proved fatal. In 1711, in the small village of Islandmagie, a young woman began behaving strangely, claiming she was being tormented by unseen spirits, hurling household objects violently around the room and collapsing repeatedly into fits. 8 local women were arrested and put on trial, accused of bewitching her. The evidence against them was essentially spectral in nature, meaning it existed only within the accuser's own account, backed up by the usual damning circumstantial proof that several of the accused women happened to be poor, argumentative, or simply not especially well liked by their neighbors. They were convicted, publicly pilloried, and imprisoned. This case became the very last formal witchcraft trial ever held in Ireland, which is a strange and remarkably specific thing to be able to date so precisely. It stands today as a sobering reminder that, for a very long stretch of history, simply being an unpopular woman with a sharp tongue could be treated as a criminal offense carrying genuine supernatural aggravating factors. The case began with a young woman who had arrived in the area, and before long, began to suffer dramatic and deeply frightening episodes. She fell repeatedly into fits and convulsions, complained bitterly of being pinched and tormented by unseen forces, claimed to see disturbing apparitions, and reportedly produced strange objects, coughing up or expelling small household items in a manner that was, at the time, taken as a classic and unmistakable sign of demonic affliction. To modern eyes, there are any number of possible, far more mundane explanations, ranging from genuine physical illness to acute psychological distress to outright deliberate fabrication. But to the tightly knit community around her in the early 18th century, the meaning seemed entirely clear and genuinely terrifying. She was bewitched, and someone in the community was directly responsible. Suspicion quickly fell on a group of local women, eventually numbering 8 in total, who were formally accused of tormenting her through witchcraft. The truly striking thing about the accused women is how thoroughly ordinary and how genuinely vulnerable, each of them actually was. Women marked out less by any real evidence of sorcery, and far more by the sort of everyday qualities that simply made a person an easy target. They were, by various surviving accounts, poor, plain-looking, and rough in manner. Some were specifically known locally for smoking, drinking, or having a notoriously bad temper, exactly the kind of people a tight-knit, frightened community was already primed and ready to think poorly of. In a witchcraft trial of this era, a simple reputation for being disagreeable could do all the damning work that actual physical evidence never managed to provide. And evidence, in any real sense, was almost entirely absent from the proceedings. The case rested almost entirely on spectral evidence, meaning the sworn testimony that the afflicted young woman had personally seen the spirits, or the likenesses, of these particular women actively tormenting her, visions that no one else present could either confirm or meaningfully disprove, because they existed only within her own private account. On the strength of that testimony alone, combined with the generally poor character already attributed to the accused, the trial proceeded to its grim conclusion. There was no genuine need for anyone to have actually witnessed a spell being cast, or a pact being signed in blood. The sworn word of the afflicted young woman that these were the specific faces haunting her was, in that courtroom, considered entirely sufficient to put 8 separate women on trial for their lives. They were duly convicted under the witchcraft law then in force, though the punishment they ultimately received, rather than outright execution, was a term of imprisonment combined with severe public humiliation in the pillory, where they were exposed helplessly to the gathered crowd, and by some surviving accounts, pelted so viciously that several suffered genuinely lasting injuries. It was a brutal outcome, built on essentially nothing that an honest court today would ever accept as meaningful proof of anything at all, delivered against a group of women whose real offense appears to have been little more than poverty and simple unpopularity within a frightened community, actively searching for someone convenient to blame. What gives the Island Magi case its particular historical weight is its exact position in the timeline. It is remembered specifically as the last formal witchcraft trial ever held in Ireland, the final flicker of a long and genuinely shameful tradition before such prosecutions gradually faded out of the legal system entirely. That makes it a kind of grim historical bookend, a permanent marker of the exact moment the law finally stopped hunting witches, and a lasting reminder of how easily fear, superstition, and simple personal dislike could combine to comprehensively destroy innocent lives. Not every woman accused of dark powers in Ireland was destroyed by the accusation, though. A century later, another woman would face a nearly identical charge and calmly walk away from it entirely, largely because half the surrounding county secretly wanted to go on quietly using her services. In 19th century County Clare, there lived a woman named Biddy Early, and depending entirely on who you happen to ask, she was either a genuinely gifted healer or a dangerous practicing witch. People walked for days across difficult countryside just to reach her small cottage, seeking cures for sick animals, failing crops, and mysterious unexplained ailments. And she was said to consult a small blue bottle in which she could reportedly see the future, and the underlying truth of any problem laid honestly before her. The local clergy despised her openly. The civil authorities eventually dragged her into court on formal charges of witchcraft. And yet, remarkably, nobody would agree to testify against her, because it turned out that roughly half the county had quietly made use of her services at one point or another, and rather hoped to be able to do so again in the future. She was acquitted outright. The famous blue bottle, according to legend, was eventually thrown into a lake after her death, where hopeful treasure hunters have been enthusiastically failing to find it ever since. Biddy Early was a real woman who genuinely lived in rural County Clare during the 1800s, and within her own lifetime, she became a true living legend across the entire west of Ireland. She occupied a role that was once fairly common in tight rural communities, that of the wise woman or local healer, the person you sought out specifically when ordinary remedies had already failed, and you needed something older, stranger, and more powerful. She dispensed herbal cures, practical advice, and what people genuinely took to be authentic supernatural insight, and her reputation eventually spread so widely that the sick and the desperate traveled great distances entirely on foot just to seek her out in person. For a great many poor rural people with no meaningful access to trained doctors, a woman like Biddy Early wasn't merely a curiosity. She was, quite literally, a lifeline. At the very center of her legend sat the famous blue bottle. According to the surrounding stories, Biddy possessed a small, dark bottle into which she would gaze intently to divine both the underlying cause of a person's trouble and the proper cure for it, seeing things entirely hidden from ordinary sight. Where the bottle itself originally came from is, appropriately enough, the stuff of pure folklore, with various tales claiming it was a gift from the fairies, or perhaps from the spirit of someone dear to her who had already passed. Whatever its true origin, the bottle became utterly inseparable from her reputation, both the source and the enduring symbol of her uncanny knowledge, and the one object everyone instantly associated with her considerable power. That power inevitably made her enemies, and the most determined among them was the local church. The clergy regarded her healing work and her divination practices as something dangerously close to outright sorcery, a rival spiritual authority actively drawing simple, faithful people away from proper religious observance and into dangerous superstition instead. They preached openly against her from the pulpit and warned their congregations firmly to stay well away. This sustained hostility, combined with a broader general unease surrounding anyone credited with genuine supernatural gifts, eventually brought her before the civil courts on a formal charge related to witchcraft, the old law still carrying provisions that could quite easily be turned against exactly this sort of local reputation. And here the community's true underlying feelings became wonderfully, almost comically clear. For all the official public disapproval directed her way, the case against her ultimately collapsed for a very simple and very human reason. Witnesses flatly refused to come forward and condemn her. The very people who might otherwise have testified against her were, in a great many cases, people who had themselves quietly sought her help at some point, or who hoped they might need to again at some point in the future, and none of them were remotely willing to send her to ruin over it. Without any willing witnesses prepared to testify, the prosecution had essentially nothing to work with, and she was acquitted and allowed to simply return home. It stands as a rare and genuinely satisfying instance of ordinary rural people quietly protecting one of their own from the full weight of the authorities, simply by collectively keeping their mouths shut. Biddy Early lived out the remainder of her days and eventually died in relative poverty, despite her considerable fame, and her legend only grew larger after her death. The famous blue bottle, so the story goes, was thrown into a nearby lake, deliberately cast away so that its considerable power could never be misused by anyone else. And there, according to the legend, it supposedly lies still. Over the years, hopeful searchers have repeatedly tried to find it, dredging both the lake and the story itself for a real physical object resting somewhere at the bottom of the water, and have always come away entirely empty-handed, which is perhaps precisely how Biddy Early herself would have wanted things to remain. Biddy defied the authorities from the modest comfort of a small cottage in County Clare. Centuries earlier, another remarkable Irish woman had defied authority on a far grander stage entirely, sailing directly into the presence of a reigning queen and flatly refusing to bow. Grace O'Malley, known in the Irish language as Grain Mhale, spent much of the 16th century commanding her own fleet of ships along the wild western coast of Ireland, raiding, trading, and generally refusing to accept the widespread notion that piracy was somehow not a suitable career path for a noblewoman. When the English crown eventually seized her sons and confiscated her lands, she did not send a lawyer to plead her case. She sailed her own personal ship all the way to England and demanded a direct, personal audience with Queen Elizabeth I. The two women met in 1593, reportedly conversing in Latin because Grace flatly refused to speak English with her, and negotiated with one another essentially as equals, one queen to another in every meaningful sense. Grace even declined to bow before the English monarch, on the stated grounds that she did not recognize Elizabeth as the rightful Queen of Ireland in the first place. She walked away with much of what she had come for, and sailed calmly home. Legends do not usually stroll out of a royal palace grinning, but this particular one very much did. Grace O'Malley was born into a seafaring family that controlled a substantial stretch of Ireland's wild western coastline, and the sea was quite literally in her blood from earliest childhood. The most famous story from her youth has her as a young girl being told firmly that she could not join her father on a sea voyage because her long hair would inevitably tangle in the ship's ropes, whereupon she promptly cut it all off herself, earning the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life, the Bold One, or the Cropped One. Whether or not that particular tale is literally, historically true, it captures her personality perfectly. This was a woman who met every single obstacle placed in her path with stubborn, practical defiance, and simply removed it from her way entirely. As an adult, she took firm command of her family's considerable maritime power and turned it into a genuinely formidable operation. She led entire fleets, controlled shipping traffic throughout her home waters, exacted tolls from vessels passing through her territory, traded across a wide area, and raided whenever it suited her purposes, becoming a genuine and widely recognized power on the western seas, at a time when such open authority in the hands of a woman was almost entirely unheard of anywhere in Europe. She married, was widowed, married again, bore several children, and throughout all of it, she never once loosened her grip on either her ships or her men, commanding real respect through sheer demonstrated capability in a brutally hard and unforgiving world. Her life inevitably collided head-on with the English crown, as Tudor power pressed ever more aggressively into Ireland, seeking to bring the independent Gaelic lords and their scattered territories fully to heel. Grace's entire world came under increasing and sustained threat, and matters finally came to a head when an English governor captured several members of her own family, including her sons, and seized both her cattle and her lands in one sweeping move, striking directly at absolutely everything she held dear. Faced with the total ruin of both her family and her hard-won power, she made a decision of genuinely breathtaking boldness. Rather than continue fighting a losing battle at home, she would go straight to the very top and appeal directly to the monarch herself. So Grace O'Malley sailed to England and successfully secured a face-to-face meeting with Queen Elizabeth I, a remarkable achievement in itself for an Irish sea captain, the English crown, officially regarded as little better than a common rebel and pirate. The encounter between these two formidable women has since passed firmly into legend, and the surviving details are genuinely delicious. Lacking any shared everyday language they could both fully trust, the two women are said to have conversed together in Latin, the shared language of the educated elite of the era. Grace reportedly declined outright to bow before Elizabeth as her sovereign, on the stated grounds that she did not accept Elizabeth as the rightful Queen of Ireland in the first place, a piece of sheer nerve that could very easily have ended in disaster, and instead seems to have earned her a weary, grudging respect from the English Queen. By every account that survives, the meeting went astonishingly well for Grace. The two aging, powerful women reached a genuine mutual understanding, and Elizabeth agreed to a substantial number of her specific requests, including the release of her captured family and continued support that allowed her to maintain her position back home. Grace sailed home afterward, having successfully negotiated as an equal with the single most powerful monarch in the entire region, and went on to live out the rest of her life continuing her seafaring career. Two aging, powerful women from utterly opposed worlds had sat down together quietly and struck a genuine deal. Grace O'Malley bent a reigning queen to her own terms through sheer, unshakable force of personality. Not all Irish traditions, however, are quite so grand in scale. Some of the strangest surviving customs are small, stubborn, deeply local rituals of the countryside, like the peculiar one where entire villages spend a cold winter's day chasing down a very small bird indeed. On St. Stephen's Day, the 26th of December, in certain parts of Ireland, you may still encounter groups of people dressed in elaborate straw costumes and painted faces, parading noisily through the streets with music, in an ancient custom known as hunting the wren. Historically, the tiny wren, of all the birds actually available to choose from, was ritually hunted, and its small body was then carried from house to house, mounted on a decorated pole, while the so-called wren boys sang, danced, and collected small coins from each household along the way. Why the wren specifically earned this rather harsh seasonal treatment is buried deep within tangled, overlapping folklore. One story blames the little bird for betraying Irish soldiers by beating its wings loudly on a drum at precisely the wrong moment. Another ties the custom to far older midwinter rituals concerning death and rebirth. These days, no actual living wren comes to any harm whatsoever, mercifully, and a fake bird does the job instead. But the sight of straw-costumed figures looming suddenly out of the winter fog remains gloriously, unapologetically strange to witness. Picture the scene as it once genuinely unfolded. On the morning after Christmas, when most of the modern world is horizontal on a sofa somewhere, quietly regretting its recent life choices, groups of men and boys would rise early, dress themselves in elaborate outfits woven entirely from straw, sometimes topped with tall conical straw masks that concealed the face completely, and set off together across the parish. They carried a decorated pole, or sometimes a bundle of holly, and mounted upon it sat the wren, and they moved from door to door making music, dancing energetically, and demanding a small contribution from each household in exchange for the considerable honor of their visit. To open your front door on St. Stephen's morning and find a huddle of faceless straw figures singing enthusiastically on your doorstep was simply an accepted part of the festive season. The costumes themselves are the detail that lingers longest in the mind. The straw disguises, which transformed ordinary neighbors into anonymous, shuffling, oddly otherworldly shapes, served a genuinely practical purpose. They concealed identities, allowing ordinary people to step briefly outside their everyday selves for a single day, and behave with a kind of license they would never normally be permitted to take. And they gave the entire affair a distinct air of the uncanny, of visitors arriving from somewhere considerably older and stranger than the familiar village. It's a very old idea indeed, the notion that on certain fixed days of the year the ordinary rules of behavior loosen considerably, and people put on masks in order to become, briefly, something else entirely. The great remaining puzzle, of course, is the bird itself. Of all the creatures available to single out for a ritual pursuit like this, the wren is one of the smallest and least threatening in all of Ireland, which only deepens the mystery of why it was ever cast as the villain of midwinter. The surviving folklore offers several competing answers. One tradition holds the wren directly guilty of treachery, blaming the bird for betraying Irish forces to their enemies by making noise at exactly the wrong moment, beating its wings on a drum, or otherwise alerting the approaching foe, and so earning itself eternal ritual punishment. Another blames the bird instead for betraying a Christian saint. These tales collectively cast the hunters in a role of rough seasonal justice, an annual settling of an ancient score against a small feathered traitor. But the true roots of the custom almost certainly run considerably deeper, reaching down into pre-Christian midwinter traditions concerned with the turning of the year, the symbolic death of the old season, and the birth of the new one. The wren, sometimes called the king of the birds in wider European folklore, may have carried a symbolic weight far beyond its physically tiny size. Its ritual death at the very darkest point of the year appears tied to much older ideas about sacrifice, renewal, and the eventual return of the light. The various later legends that survive may simply represent attempts to explain a much older custom whose true original meaning was already lost, even to the people actively practicing it. Today, the tradition survives in a gentler, revived form, especially in the southwest of the country, complete with elaborate processions, music, and costumes, and absolutely no living wren involved at all anymore. It has become, in its modern form, a genuine celebration of local heritage and a splendid excuse for a midwinter community party. The wren boys crown no king today, only a small, unfortunate bird. But elsewhere in Ireland, on a warm summer's day, an entirely different and very real coronation takes place, and this particular monarch happens to have 4 legs. Every August, in the small town of Killorglin in County Kerry, an event unfolds that no one has ever successfully managed to explain to a bewildered outsider without sounding at least slightly unwell. A wild mountain goat is carefully captured, brought down into the town, hoisted high onto a tall platform above the assembled crowds, and formally crowned King Puck, ruler of the surrounding festivities for 3 full days of drinking, trading, and open celebration. The goat presides serenely over everything from his elevated perch, fed and watered like the genuine, legally recognized monarch he temporarily becomes, before finally being safely returned to his home mountain once the festival concludes. This is Puck Fair, one of the oldest continuously held festivals in all of Ireland, its true origins lost somewhere in the mists of ancient harvest custom, and possibly tangled up with an old story about a goat that once warned an entire town of approaching soldiers. For 3 days a year in County Kerry, the head of state is, quite literally, a goat. And honestly, when you consider the alternatives throughout history, we have all done considerably worse. The ceremony itself remains a genuine spectacle to witness. In the run-up to the fair, a wild goat is caught out in the surrounding mountains and carried down into Killorglin, where a young girl from the town, specifically chosen for the honor, and given the formal title of Queen of the Fair, performs the actual crowning ceremony. The goat is fitted with a crown, formally proclaimed King Puck, and then raised up on a tall stand or tower erected in the very center of town, where he remains enthroned high above the crowd for the full duration of the festivities. Down below, the entire town gives itself over completely to celebration, and the goat looks on, entirely impassive, as generations of his predecessors have done before him, year after year. Around this genuinely improbable centerpiece swirls one of Ireland's great traditional gatherings. Puck Fair is, among other things, a very old and very serious horse and livestock fair, a day when farmers and traders converge from across the region to buy and sell animals in the age-old traditional way, and that entirely practical agricultural business sits comfortably right alongside all the pageantry. There is music, there are market stalls, there is enthusiastic dancing, there is a genuinely enormous amount of drinking, and the entire town swells considerably with visitors who travel from far and wide specifically for these 3 days each year. It is, at once, a genuinely serious event on the rural farming calendar, and an outbreak of thoroughly collective, entirely good-natured madness. The precise origins of the whole tradition remain genuinely uncertain, which only adds further to its considerable charm. The most beloved explanation offered is a tale of a single goat that supposedly saved the entire town. In this version of events, a herd of wild goats was startled by approaching soldiers in the surrounding mountains, and one animal, breaking away from the herd in fright, ran directly down into Killorglin in a state of obvious agitation, alerting the townspeople to the coming danger with just enough time to properly prepare. In gratitude, so the story goes, the town honored that goat's kind forever afterward by crowning one of its own each and every year. It's a genuinely lovely story, and like so many lovely Irish origin stories, it may very well have been invented long after the underlying custom itself was already old. Historians tend to suspect instead that the fair actually reaches back to far older traditions, quite possibly to pre-Christian harvest festivals and seasonal gatherings tied closely to the natural rhythms of the farming year, with the goat itself carrying much older symbolic associations of fertility, wildness, and general abundance. Whatever its true and original source, the fair has now been held for many centuries, weathering every determined attempt by the more respectable and the more pious to tame or abolish it entirely, surviving stubbornly as a living remnant of an older, wilder way of marking the turning seasons. And at the heart of it all remains the goat, treated for 3 full days with genuine care and something close to real reverence, fed and watered on his high perch before being safely brought back down and released to return to the freedom of his home mountains, his brief reign now finally over. It is absurd. It is genuinely ancient. And it is, in its own peculiar way, completely sincere. Kilorglin crowns a goat and then lets him go. In the capital city, something considerably more valuable was also once placed carefully on high, locked away for supposedly permanent safekeeping, and then it simply, inexplicably vanished. In 1907, the Irish crown jewels, a dazzling set of ceremonial regalia kept securely inside Dublin Castle, disappeared entirely without a trace. They had been locked inside a safe within a strong room, situated in one of the most heavily guarded buildings in the entire country, just days before an important royal visit was scheduled to take place. When officials finally went to check on them, the safe was found neatly opened, and the jewels were simply gone, with no sign whatsoever of any forced entry and no broken locks anywhere to be found. The investigation that followed was, by any measure, an absolute shambles, tangled up thoroughly in personal scandal and quiet institutional cover-ups, with certain suspects apparently protected for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with justice. More than a century later, the jewels have never once been recovered, and the case has never officially been solved. Somewhere out there, in theory at least, a genuine fortune in stolen gems is still sitting quietly in a drawer somewhere, and an entire nation is still politely wondering exactly where it went. The jewels themselves formed a magnificent set of ceremonial regalia, a jeweled star and matching badge, thoroughly encrusted with precious stones, used specifically in the ceremonies of a chivalric order, and widely regarded as objects of truly enormous value and considerable prestige. They were kept inside Dublin Castle, the very seat of British administration in Ireland at the time, and were supposed to be secured within a specially built strong room. The arrangements for their safety were, at least on paper, entirely thorough. In practice, as the entire affair would eventually reveal, they were an absolute mess, and the jewels ended up stored instead in a safe kept in a library, simply because the safe itself turned out to be too large to physically fit through the door of the strong room it had originally been purchased for. The disappearance was discovered just days before a major royal visit to Ireland, which instantly turned an already embarrassing theft into a full-blown public scandal at the single worst possible moment imaginable. When the safe was finally opened for inspection, the jewels were simply not there. What made the whole affair so genuinely baffling and so deeply unnerving was the complete and total absence of any sign of a break-in whatsoever. The safe had clearly been opened either with a proper key or with a perfect working knowledge of exactly how to open it, and then locked again neatly afterward, and the various doors that should have been secured showed absolutely no damage at all. Whoever had taken the jewels had not smashed their way in. They had simply walked in, opened the safe, helped themselves to the contents, and tidied up carefully behind them, which pointed rather uncomfortably toward someone with genuine inside access and detailed knowledge of the building's security. The investigation that followed became notorious, both for going essentially nowhere, and for the strong lingering suspicion that it was never really allowed to go anywhere in the first place. The affair reached directly into circles closely connected to the castle's own administration, and it quickly became entangled with personal scandals and reputations that certain powerful people were extremely keen to keep entirely out of public view. Rather than a vigorous, determined pursuit of the truth, the inquiry seemed instead to bog down repeatedly in evasion and quiet protection, with awkward avenues of investigation deliberately left unexplored, and the whole matter increasingly handled as something to be carefully contained rather than genuinely solved. Suspicion swirled persistently around several individuals connected to the safekeeping of the jewels, but nothing was ever formally proven, and no one was ever convicted of any crime whatsoever. The result stands today as one of the great unsolved mysteries of its particular kind. The jewels vanished completely and were never seen again, at least not publicly. Over the following decades, theories multiplied endlessly, involving inside jobs, blackmail, gambling debts, and quiet cover-ups reaching into genuinely high places, and various stories circulated about the regalia having eventually been broken up and sold piece by piece, or hidden away somewhere, or spirited abroad entirely. None of these theories has ever been definitively confirmed. The trail, already cold to begin with, went utterly and permanently frozen. To this very day, the Irish crown jewels remain lost, an enduring puzzle with no solution in sight, a genuine fortune that simply evaporated from inside a supposed fortress and was never, ever recovered. The jewels disappeared notably, without a single sound. A few decades earlier, Ireland had experienced the exact opposite kind of event, a single night so deafening and so violently destructive that people across the country genuinely believed the world itself was finally ending. On a bitter January night in 1839, a hurricane of almost unimaginable force tore violently across the entire island of Ireland. It became known ever afterward as the Night of the Big Wind. Roofs were ripped clean off homes, entire houses were flattened, church spires came crashing down, and hundreds of people ultimately died as the storm screamed relentlessly through the darkness. Many genuinely believed the world was ending that night, that the day of final judgment had truly arrived at last, and some blamed the fairies directly, convinced they were leaving Ireland all at once, en masse, and taking the terrible weather with them as they departed. But here is the truly strange afterlife of that single, terrible night. 70 years later, when the old age pension was first introduced, and people had to somehow prove they were over 70 years old without any surviving birth certificates to rely on, government officials began asking applicants one simple, deceptively effective question. Do you remember the night of the big wind? If you genuinely did remember it, you got your pension approved. One single storm ended up quietly serving as an entire nation's collective proof of age. To properly understand the terror of that night, you have to understand just how sudden and how total the storm truly was. Ireland in the early 19th century was a land of thatched cottages, small family farms, and modest towns full of buildings never remotely designed to withstand anything close to what arrived that particular night. The wind rose to ferocity beyond anything within living memory, a screaming, sustained assault that continued for hours through the depths of a bitter winter night, in an age with no weather warnings, no forecasts, and absolutely no way to know what was actually happening beyond the simple fact that the sky itself had apparently gone completely mad. People huddled together in the pitch darkness as their homes came apart violently around them, with nothing left to do but pray and simply endure. The destruction across the country was genuinely staggering. Thatched roofs were torn away entirely and scattered for miles. Houses collapsed outright, walls fell, and countless buildings were either damaged or completely destroyed. In the towns, chimneys and church spires came crashing down one after another. Trees were uprooted by the thousands, whole plantations flattened in a matter of hours. Fires broke out wherever hearths were exposed or their embers scattered by the wind, and then spread rapidly on the raging gale. Livestock died in open fields and out at sea alike, and along the coastline, boats and entire ships were wrecked against the rocks. Hundreds of people lost their lives that single night, and vast numbers more were left utterly homeless in the bitter January cold, their shelter simply blown away in the space of a single night. The psychological impact of the storm matched its sheer physical devastation. For a deeply religious and genuinely superstitious population, a catastrophe of this scale, arriving suddenly out of nowhere in the dead of night, felt like something considerably more than mere weather. Many people were absolutely convinced that this was truly it, the end of the world, the long-promised day of judgment finally arriving, and that the terrible screaming wind was itself the sound of the final reckoning. Others reached instead for older explanations drawn from the folklore that still ran deep throughout the countryside, and concluded that the fairies themselves were on the move, abandoning Ireland en masse, and that the unearthly storm was simply the sound and fury of their great collective departure. However people ultimately made sense of that terrible night, it burned itself permanently into the national memory, and that lasting impression is precisely what gives the night of the big wind its remarkable second life decades later. Years afterward, when a formal pension for the elderly was finally introduced by the government, it created an entirely unexpected practical problem. A great many older people had been born at a time, and in a place where births simply weren't systematically recorded, and they had no surviving documents whatsoever to prove exactly how old they actually were. Officials urgently needed some reliable way to establish whether a given applicant had genuinely reached the qualifying age, and they eventually found one in the storm itself. Since the night of the big wind was seared permanently into the memory of absolutely everyone who had lived through it, and had occurred on a precisely known date, officials could simply ask each applicant whether they personally remembered it. A clear, convincing memory of that unforgettable night was formally accepted as sufficient evidence that a person was genuinely old enough to qualify for the pension. So a single catastrophic storm became, in effect, an entire nation's informal birth certificate, its fixed date used as a universal reference point against which countless individual lives could finally be measured. The wind that people thought in the moment was the end of the entire world turned out, 70 years later, to be the very thing that secured their comfortable old age. The big wind entered Irish folklore permanently through sheer, overwhelming destruction. Another great Irish institution entered the record books instead for something far more optimistic, a single piece of paperwork so confident in tone that it looks almost genuinely unhinged in retrospect. In 1759, a man named Arthur Guinness walked up to a disused, run-down brewery at St. James's Gate in Dublin and calmly signed a lease. Not a 10-year lease, not even a generous 50-year lease. He signed a lease for 9,000 years at a fixed annual rent of £45, which even by the standards of the time was the sort of brazen confidence that makes a bank manager visibly loosen his collar. It suggested either extraordinary long-term optimism, or a man who simply had absolutely no intention of ever leaving. The brewery went on to become one of the single most famous brewing operations on the entire planet, and remarkably, the original lease technically still has well over 8,000 years left to run. Somewhere in a filing cabinet in Dublin sits a piece of paper cheerfully committing an entire business to an arrangement that stretches almost to the year 11,000. Let's sit with the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of that number for a moment, because it is genuinely difficult to process properly. 9,000 years is not merely a long lease. It represents a span of time considerably longer than the entirety of recorded human history put together. When Arthur Guinness put his signature to that document, he was formally committing to an arrangement that, if honored all the way to its natural conclusion, would run further into the future than the invention of written language itself lies in the past. It is the kind of time frame that properly belongs in geology or astronomy, not in a simple property agreement between a brewer and his landlord. And yet there it is, spelled out clearly in ink, a 9 followed by 3 confident zeros, describing the formal term of a humble brewery lease. The surrounding circumstances make the whole affair even more striking. Arthur Guinness took on a brewery that had genuinely fallen into total disuse, an unpromising, run-down site that he personally intended to bring back to vigorous life, and he secured it on these truly astonishing terms, including a rent fixed at a fairly modest annual sum that would technically never rise for the entire 9,000-year duration of the agreement. In an age of considerable commercial uncertainty, when countless businesses failed outright and fortunes came and went with alarming regularity, here was a man calmly locking in his position for what amounts to eternity and permanently pinning down his operating costs forever. Whether this represented breathtaking long-term vision, remarkably canny negotiation, or simply reflected the way certain long leases happened to be drawn up during that particular era, the practical effect remains exactly the same, an act of almost comic confidence directed squarely at the distant future. And remarkably, that confidence was, against all reasonable odds, entirely vindicated by history. The brewery at St. James's Gate did not fail. It grew and grew and grew, until the dark stout produced there became one of the single most recognizable beverage products anywhere in the entire world, exported across the globe and bound up tightly with the very image of Ireland itself in the popular imagination. The modest, disused site that Arthur Guinness originally leased for 9 full millennia became an absolutely enormous, world-famous commercial operation, the beating heart of an entire global brewing empire. The wildly optimistic lease turned out, in hindsight, to be one of the single greatest bargains in the entire history of commerce, securing the ground for what would eventually become a genuine global phenomenon. The lease itself has since become a cherished, celebrated piece of the company's founding story, a lasting symbol of the founder's sheer audacity, and the original document, with its extraordinary 9,000-year term, is treated today as a genuine historical relic in its own right. Visitors touring the brewery today can hear the full tale of the 9,000-year commitment, and it is repeated with obvious, justified delight, because it is exactly the kind of detail that sounds entirely invented and simply is not. In the strict letter of the original agreement, the lease still has the overwhelming majority of its term left to run, thousands upon thousands of years stretching off into an almost unimaginable future. Of course, the business itself long ago expanded far beyond the physical boundaries of that original lease plot, so the document today functions more as a beloved historical curiosity than as any kind of genuine ongoing constraint. But as a monument to sheer commercial optimism, it remains genuinely unbeatable. A man once looked at a single empty, run-down brewery and calmly signed up for 9,000 years, and history ultimately proved him entirely right to do so. Arthur Guinness bet confidently on the distant future using nothing more than a scrap of paper. Out in the Irish countryside, though, the people have always been considerably more careful about the past, and about certain patches of ground they flatly refuse to disturb, no matter how much money is offered. Scattered across the entire Irish countryside are literally tens of thousands of ring forts, ancient circular earthworks left behind by people who lived on this land well over 1,000 years ago. In local folklore, these are known as fairy forts, the homes and gathering places of the good people, and interfering with one in any way is considered a genuinely, catastrophically bad idea. Farmers have plowed carefully around them for generation after generation, deliberately leaving small islands of completely untouched trees and earthen mounds standing right in the middle of otherwise fully productive farmland, because damaging a fairy fort is widely said to bring illness, financial ruin, and even death upon the person responsible. And this is not merely some quaint memory drawn from the distant past. As recently as 1999, a respected folklorist publicly warned that removing a single lone fairy thorn bush to make way for a new stretch of motorway would directly cause fatal traffic accidents. The story traveled around the entire world, and the road itself was actually rerouted around the bush. The bush is still standing there today. So is the road, bending politely around it to this very day. The ring forts themselves are entirely real and genuinely ancient beyond question. They are the physical remains of the enclosed farmsteads and homesteads of early medieval Ireland, circular banks and ditches that once surrounded and protected individual family dwellings, and they survive in truly enormous numbers scattered right across the Irish landscape, making them one of the single most common ancient monuments found anywhere in the entire country. Over the intervening centuries, as their original practical purpose was gradually forgotten by later generations, they steadily took on a distinctly supernatural character within the popular imagination. These circular enclosures, frequently overgrown with wild trees and standing alone in the middle of otherwise open fields, became firmly associated with the fairies, the good people, and came to be understood not as old, ordinary human dwellings at all, but instead as the active dwelling places and regular haunts of the otherworld itself. Along with this widespread belief came a genuinely powerful body of taboo surrounding the disturbance of these sites. To interfere with a fairy fort in any way, to plow it under, cut down its trees, remove its stones, or build directly upon it, was understood to invite the direct anger of the fairies, and the consequences of doing so were held to be genuinely severe. Countless stories survive of people who damaged such a place and were struck down afterward by sudden sickness, by devastating financial ruin, by a prolonged run of terrible luck, or even by outright death, whether their own personal death or that of their livestock or immediate family members. The clear lesson drawn from these many stories was simple and genuinely stark, that these particular places were to be left completely and permanently alone, and that no practical gain imaginable was ever worth the considerable risk of provoking whatever truly lived there. The direct result of all this remains clearly visible across the modern Irish landscape to this very day. Across the entire country, farmers have worked carefully around these sites for many generations, plowing and planting their crops right up to the very edges of a ring fort, while consistently leaving the fort itself entirely untouched. The result is that a perfectly modern working field may still contain a small, wild, tree-crowned island of ground that has genuinely never once been disturbed, simply because it happens to be a fairy fort. This persistent caution isn't necessarily because every single modern farmer literally believes in fairies in a strict sense. It's often something more like a deeply inherited caution, a general sense that certain things are better left exactly as they have always been left, combined with a natural reluctance to be the very first person to break an old, deeply established rule, and that particular caution remains very much alive today. The most famous modern example of this concerned a single, lone hawthorn bush, a type of tree strongly associated with the fairies throughout Irish folklore, which happened to stand directly in the planned path of a new motorway. When it emerged publicly that the bush was widely regarded as a genuine fairy tree, a marker specifically positioned along a fairy path, a prominent local folklorist warned publicly and repeatedly that destroying it would bring serious misfortune and even death down upon those who would later use the new road. The story caught fire in the media, drawing genuine international attention and no small amount of good-natured amusement from around the world. And in the end, the road authorities quietly chose to spare the bush entirely. The road was built carefully around it instead, and the tree remained standing exactly where it had always stood. It represents a wonderful, genuine collision of the ancient and the thoroughly modern, a major national motorway physically bending its entire course out of simple deference to the fairies. And it turns out this isn't even the strangest official accommodation Ireland's little people have ever successfully secured for themselves. Yes, this next one is entirely real, and yes, it is genuinely, properly documented. In the small town of Carlingford, in County Louth, a local community campaign spent several years actively lobbying, and in 2009, they finally succeeded in having the leprechauns of the nearby mountain formally granted official legal protection under the European Union's Habitats Directive, the very same body of environmental law that shields rare birds and endangered wildflowers across the entire continent. The reasoning eventually offered by the responsible officials was gloriously, entirely unarguable. They could not definitively prove that leprechauns existed, but equally, they could not definitively prove that they did not exist either. And in the face of that genuine uncertainty, formal protection seemed like the safest and most sensible available option. By the campaigners' own careful count, there are said to be exactly 236 of them remaining, living quietly on the slopes of Slieve Foy. There is now an annual leprechaun hunt held in the town, a dedicated folklore park, and a genuine, legally binding European directive quietly safeguarding what remains of Ireland's last little people. The whole affair traces back directly to a story from the town's more recent folklore, involving a local man who reported an extraordinary personal discovery. According to the tale, he heard a sudden scream coming from up on the mountain and went to investigate the source. And there, beside a patch of oddly scorched ground, he found a tiny set of clothes, a little hat and jacket and matching trousers, along with a small handful of gold coins. This particular discovery, claimed at the time to be the genuine garments and treasure of a real leprechaun, became the original seed of a local leprechaun tradition, a story the entire town gradually embraced and steadily built upon over the years, and it gave Carlingford a special, distinctive claim to being the true home of Ireland's little people. From that small seed grew a genuinely determined campaign, led by a dedicated local enthusiast who took the cause of the leprechauns entirely seriously, or at the very least seriously enough to pursue it through all the proper official channels for several years running. The stated goal was to have the leprechauns and their mountain habitat formally granted official protection, and the chosen vehicle for achieving this was the European Habitats Directive, the standard legal framework used to protect threatened species and important natural environments across every member state of the European Union. It's a piece of legislation carefully designed to protect rare plants, birds, and animals, and the campaigners set out, quite deliberately, to have the little people formally added to the official list of things it safeguarded. Remarkably, after a long and sustained process, they actually succeeded. The area was formally brought under the full protection of the directive, and that protection was understood to extend not only to the flora, fauna, and wild animals of the mountain in the conventional sense, but, in the campaigners' own official telling, to the leprechauns themselves as well. The underlying logic that made this whole outcome possible has a wonderful, watertight sort of silliness to it. Faced directly with the question of whether leprechauns genuinely existed, and therefore merited formal legal protection, the official response was that their existence could be neither definitively proven nor definitively disproven, and that in the face of such genuine uncertainty, the appropriately cautious and responsible course of action was simply to protect them, just in case. It is essentially impossible to argue with that logic, and nobody in an official capacity seriously tried to. Around this newly established legal status, a whole living local tradition now flourishes each year. Carlingford celebrates its leprechauns with genuine, infectious enthusiasm, hosting an annual hunt in which visitors search the mountainside for hidden leprechaun figures, maintaining a dedicated folklore park that tells the local stories in full, and generally leaning fully into its distinctive identity as the last refuge of Ireland's little people. The famous figure of 236, the supposed exact number of surviving leprechauns, is cited officially as the population that the protection exists specifically to preserve, a precise and thoroughly delightful census of the fundamentally uncountable. It is, in the end, a perfect Irish blend of folklore, genuine humor, tourism, and honest legal fact all rolled into one. A body of serious European environmental law, originally drafted for the entirely serious business of wildlife conservation, was successfully invoked to shelter a species that most of the wider world regards as entirely mythical, and the protection genuinely stands to this day. The leprechauns of Slieve Foy remain protected, precisely because no one can definitively prove they were never there at all. Ireland's bogs, however, have preserved plenty of things whose genuine existence is entirely beyond any reasonable doubt, including creatures that would comfortably dwarf a fully grown person standing beside them. When workers cut turf from Ireland's extensive bogs, they occasionally haul up something genuinely enormous, a set of antlers so vast they look almost like an elaborate stage prop. These belong to the giant Irish deer, sometimes also called the Irish elk, a truly colossal animal that stood considerably taller than a grown adult at the shoulder, and carried a rack of antlers spanning up to 3.5 meters from tip to tip, the largest of any deer species that has ever lived on this planet. They wandered across Ireland during the tail end of the last ice age, and then vanished from the landscape entirely, possibly because those magnificent antlers eventually became a fatal fashion statement. As the surrounding climate and available vegetation shifted dramatically around them, their bones and antlers were preserved for many thousands of years within the airless, acidic peat, and today they hang proudly in grand historic houses and museums, an unsettling and genuinely humbling reminder that the soggy field you might be standing in today was once patrolled by a deer roughly the physical size of a small family car. The sheer scale of this animal is genuinely difficult to properly overstate. This was not merely a slightly larger than average deer. It was a genuine giant, a towering beast that stood at the shoulder around the same height as a fairly tall man, built on a massive underlying frame, and crowned with a rack of antlers so enormous that they remain, to this day, the largest known antlers from any deer species in the entire history of the world. Those antlers could span the width of a small room, sweeping outward on either side of the animal's head in great palmate sheets, and remarkably, they were regrown entirely fresh each and every year, an astonishing feat of biology that demanded an absolutely huge investment of the creature's available resources every single season without fail. For a long time, these animals were strongly and specifically associated with Ireland, simply because so many superb, well-preserved specimens have been recovered from Irish ground over the centuries, which is precisely how they came to acquire the popular name Irish elk, even though they were neither confined exclusively to Ireland, nor, strictly speaking, true elk at all. They actually roamed across a wide swathe of the wider landscape during the cold, open conditions found around the end of the last ice age, grazing across a landscape of open tundra, very different indeed from the lush green island we know and recognize today. It was a world of tundra and open, windswept ground, and the giant deer numbered among its single most spectacular and impressive inhabitants. Then, quite suddenly in geological terms, they disappeared entirely, and the underlying reasons why have long fascinated scientists and casual observers alike. The great antlers themselves sit right at the center of one enduring, popular theory. The idea holds that this particular crowning glory had grown so extravagant over generations, driven perhaps by fierce, ongoing competition to attract mates and dominate rival males, that it eventually became a physical burden the animal could simply no longer bear once its surrounding world began to change dramatically. In this particular reading of events, the deer became, in a sense, a genuine victim of its own splendor, saddled with a magnificent, resource-hungry ornament that gradually turned into a fatal liability, once conditions grew considerably harder for the species to survive. More careful modern scientific thinking tends to place greater emphasis, instead, on the truly dramatic changes in climate and available vegetation that occurred at the very end of the Ice Age, changes which fundamentally transformed the surrounding environment and the food genuinely available to the species. Placing the giant deer under mounting ecological pressures, it simply could not ultimately survive. Whatever the precise underlying cause actually was, the animals did eventually die out completely, and here the Irish landscape itself performed one of its quiet, genuine miracles of natural preservation. The bogs that spread extensively across the country are places where organic material generally does not rot away in the usual manner, starved entirely of oxygen and steeped continuously in natural acid. And over many thousands of years, they have preserved the bones and antlers of the giant deer with truly remarkable completeness. Buried deep within the peat, these ancient remains waited patiently through the passing millennia until people cutting turf for household fuel began, every so often, to strike something huge and genuinely ancient buried in the ground beneath their feet. The results now proudly adorn museums and the grand halls of historic country houses. Enormous skulls and sweeping antlers mounted carefully on walls, drawing audible gasps from anyone who fully grasps that these remains belong to a genuinely real creature that once physically walked across this same land. It is a strange and humbling thing, indeed, to stand quietly in a modern Irish field and know that somewhere beneath the surface, or perhaps hanging on a nearby wall, sits the physical proof that true giants once grazed peacefully right here. The bogs kept safe the bones of these vanished animals for millennia. Far more unsettling still, they also kept safe the actual bodies of vanished people, preserved so perfectly that they barely look dead at all, even after 2,000 years in the ground. Every so often, Ireland's bogs quietly give up a body. Not merely a skeleton, but an entire preserved body, complete with skin, hair, fingernails, and everything else, so perfectly preserved by the acidic, oxygen-starved peat that the person can look eerily as though they died only last week, rather than some 2,000 years ago. These are the bog bodies, Iron Age men and women who met violent, deliberate ends, and were placed into the bog for reasons that were almost certainly ritual in nature rather than accidental. One of them, known today as Old Croghan Man, was a physically enormous individual with beautifully manicured hands, strongly suggesting he never performed a single day of hard manual labor in his entire life. Another, Clonacavin Man, styled his hair upright using a kind of hair gel imported from what is now Spain or France, which means that Iron Age Ireland apparently had both ritual human sacrifice and imported hair products at more or less the same time. The bog kept them, and their secrets, safely hidden for millennia. The preservation itself is really what makes these discoveries so profoundly strange to encounter. In an ordinary grave, soft tissue vanishes within a fairly short span of time, leaving behind only bare bone. But the conditions found inside a peat bog are genuinely extraordinary, cold, highly acidic, and almost entirely without oxygen, and together they arrest the normal processes of decay almost completely. Skin is effectively tanned and preserved rather than lost entirely. Hair remains exactly in place. Facial features are held in something remarkably close to their original living form. The result is that a person who died in the truly distant past can emerge from the ground looking uncannily whole. Their expression, their stubble, even the individual pores of their skin still clearly visible, collapsing the distance between the ancient world and our own modern one into something that feels almost unbearably intimate. The two most famous of Ireland's bog bodies bring that ancient, vanished world vividly and unsettlingly back to life. And both, tellingly, appear to belong to people of genuine apparent status who met genuinely brutal ends. Old Croghan Man was a strikingly tall and powerfully built individual, and careful examination of his remains revealed hands that were smooth and clearly well cared for, with neat, tidy nails and no sign whatsoever of the roughness, and wear that a life spent in manual labor typically leaves permanently behind. This was clearly not a peasant. Everything about his physical remains points instead toward someone of genuinely high rank, well-fed throughout his life, and entirely unaccustomed to hard toil of any kind, which makes the manner of his eventual death all the more chilling to consider. Clonacavin Man offers an even more startling window into the vanity and the surprisingly wide trading connections of that distant age. His hair was found carefully dressed upward into a raised, deliberate style, held firmly in place using a substance that functioned very much like a modern styling gel. Careful chemical analysis of that substance revealed that its actual ingredients had traveled from remarkably far away, specifically from somewhere around the Mediterranean coast of Europe. This is a small detail that genuinely reaches across the intervening centuries and grabs your attention firmly. A man living in Iron Age Ireland cared enough about his personal appearance to carefully style his hair, and the specific product he used to achieve that style had traveled an enormous distance through established trade networks simply to reach him. It stands as genuine evidence of a world that was considerably more interconnected and considerably more concerned with personal fashion than we might otherwise have assumed about a society so far removed from our own in time. For all their startling, preserved humanity, these were clearly not people who died peacefully in their own beds surrounded by family. The bog bodies characteristically show unmistakable signs of violent, deliberate death, often marked by multiple distinct forms of injury inflicted all at once, a degree of deliberate overkill that points strongly away from ordinary murder or simple accident, and firmly toward something considerably more ceremonial in nature. The leading scholarly interpretation today is that these were ritual killings, genuine sacrifices, and that the apparently high status of certain victims may have been absolutely central to their ultimate fate, perhaps figures deliberately offered up in connection with kingship, agricultural fertility, or the ritual appeasement of powerful forces believed to govern the land and its bounty. Their careful placement in the bog, itself, a natural boundary standing between solid earth and open water, was very likely an integral part of the underlying rite. What the bog ultimately gives back to us, then, is not merely a preserved corpse pulled from the ground. It is a genuinely preserved moment in time, a person complete with a face, a carefully chosen hairstyle, well cared for hands, and a terrible, deliberate death, held quietly in the ground for 2,000 years, and then handed back to us almost entirely intact. The bog bodies died, it seems, so that something greater might be appeased. And that same deep human instinct, to guard carefully against the unseen powers lurking at the edge of the ordinary world, runs right through the entirety of Irish history. It eventually gave the wider world one of its most familiar and beloved modern holidays, and that holiday began not with costumes and candy at all, but at the mouth of a very dark, very real cave. Long before costumes and candy ever entered the picture, there was Samhain, the ancient Irish festival marking both the end of the harvest season and the beginning of the long, dark half of the year. It stands today as the direct ancestor of the modern holiday of Halloween. On the night of Samhain, the ancient Irish believed that the thin veil separating our world from the other world grew thin to the point of vanishing entirely, letting spirits, fairies, and assorted unpleasant supernatural things wander freely among the living for a single night. To hide safely from them, people disguised themselves, which is precisely why, to this very day, you now dress up in costumes each October. And there was one particular doorway between the worlds that the ancient Irish feared above absolutely all others. At Rathcrogan in County Roscommon sits a low, dark, almost entirely unremarkable-looking cave, known locally as Owenagget, the Cave of the Cats. It has long been described in local tradition as a genuine gateway to the otherworld, a place from which monsters and a fearsome war goddess were said to pour out each and every year on the night of Samhain. It is a real, physical cave. You can actually crawl into it today if you're brave enough. Whether anything ever truly crawls back out again is perhaps a question best left unasked, at least at this particular hour of the night. Samhain itself sat at one of the great turning points of the ancient Irish calendar year, marking the precise moment when the harvest had finally been gathered in. The bright half of the year formally ended, and the cold, dark half of the year properly began. It functioned as a genuine threshold, a hinge point between two seasons, and in the old world view, such thresholds were understood to be genuinely dangerous times, when the ordinary order of the world loosened considerably. On this single night above all others, it was firmly believed that the boundary between the world of the living and the other world, the realm of spirits, fairies, and the restless dead, grew thin to the very point of vanishing altogether, allowing things to pass through freely in both directions at once. The living and the supernatural briefly shared the very same night, and that was, understandably, not a comfortable thought for anyone to sit with. To move safely through a night like that, people took careful precautions, and chief among them was the widespread practice of disguise. By dressing up, by deliberately hiding their ordinary faces and everyday appearances, people could hope to pass unnoticed among the wandering spirits, avoiding the direct attention of anything that might otherwise mean them serious harm, or perhaps simply mimicking the otherworldly visitors closely enough not to stand out from the crowd. This is the genuine deep root of the modern custom of wearing costumes at Halloween, a tradition that began, importantly, not as simple fun, but as a real, practical defensive measure against the things believed to be actively abroad on Samhain night. Offerings of food were also traditionally left outside for the visitors, a small gesture intended to appease them and keep the household safely protected through the night. All of this fed, over many long centuries, into the modern festival the world now knows and celebrates every autumn. As the old traditions gradually blended together with later religious observances, and eventually traveled abroad with waves of Irish immigrants, Samhain slowly evolved into Halloween, carrying its ancient DNA along with it the entire way. The costumes, the pervasive sense of the dead drawing physically near, the strong association of the night with ghosts and the supernatural more broadly, the carved lanterns, and the offerings that eventually became modern trick-or-treat candy, all of it descends directly from that ancient Irish festival of the threshold, however far removed the modern celebration might now seem from its considerably more solemn and genuinely fearful origins. And at the very heart of that older tradition lies a genuinely eerie real place. At the ancient royal and ceremonial complex of Rathcrogan, there stands that cave known as Owen-Agat, a narrow, dark opening leading steadily down into the earth. In the old tradition, this cave was regarded as one of the truly great gateways to the other world, a place from which supernatural forces were said to actively emerge. It was especially and specifically associated with Samhain, when it was said that monstrous creatures, alongside a powerful and genuinely terrifying goddess of war and death, would issue forth from its dark mouth to roam freely across the land. It was, in the old belief, a door standing between two worlds, and on precisely the wrong night of the year, that door stood wide open. The truly remarkable thing is that the cave itself is entirely real, and still very much there today, waiting quietly in the fields. It is a genuine site that can still be visited by anyone curious enough, a low and rather constricted passage running steadily downward into darkness beneath the open fields of County Roscommon, physically unimpressive to look at from the outside, and yet steeped thoroughly in one of the single most potent traditions found anywhere in Irish mythology. People genuinely do still go inside. What has always given the surrounding folklore its lasting power is not really what waits patiently inside the cave itself, but rather the ancient, deeply held conviction about what, on one single night each year, was firmly believed to come pouring out. So there it is, a whole island's worth of documented history, and almost none of it behaves the way conventional history is supposed to behave. Tonight we wandered slowly through a land where a beloved saint turned out to be a foreigner, where an entire war was fought over a single cow, where a proud queen was ultimately felled by a lump of cheese, and where a legendary hero refused, quite literally, to die lying down. We met monks clinging stubbornly to a bare rock in the middle of the ocean, a giant deer hidden patiently for millennia inside a bog, a severed head calmly on public display in a working parish church, and a beer lease with well over 8,000 years still left to run. We found leprechauns formally protected by continental law, a modern motorway that quietly bowed to a single bush, and an ancient cave where the surrounding darkness was said, every single year, to briefly come alive. And the strangest part of all, the part genuinely worth carrying off with you into sleep tonight, is that none of these are simple fairy tales, invented purely to frighten small children. They are, in their own stubborn, thoroughly improbable way, largely true. Real people genuinely believed these things, lived their entire lives by them, laughed warmly at them, and carefully passed them down, generation after generation, consistently refusing to let the underlying strangeness ever be neatly tidied away and forgotten. In Ireland, the line separating what actually happened from what was simply remembered was never really a solid wall at all. It was always more of a soft, drifting mist, and everyone there rather seemed to like it that way. There is something genuinely gentle in that, when you really stop to think about it properly. A country that quietly turned its hardship into stories, its deepest fears into joyful festivals, and its long-dead kings into enduring legends, is a country that clearly understood, better than most, exactly how to survive its own long, dark nights. Which is, of course, the very same thing you are gently drifting into right now, in this quiet room, at this quiet hour. So, as you settle even deeper now into your own warm, quiet, thoroughly modern bed, spare a soft, unhurried thought for all the storytellers who kept these particular tales alive by flickering firelight, for so many centuries, so that one day, long after they themselves were gone, they could gently carry you off to sleep as well. Rest easy tonight. Whatever wanders through the mist on nights like this one, it can wait quite comfortably until morning.